in my role as president of the Public Management Research Association. And all of us who came from America are tied to this association and tied to the journal JPART in some way. So I'm currently president of the association. Carolyn Heinrich, who's from Vanderbilt University, was president at one point. I used to be a co-editor at the journal. Brad Wright is the current editor. Carolyn Heinrich is one of the previous editors. So we've a deep association with this group. Part of our goal here is to introduce you to this group, tell you a little bit more about it, as well as have a broader conversation on research in our collective fields. So, I think at the end of the day, if we want to set goals for ourselves, one of the goals we want to set for ourselves is to try and establish relationships that might be long-term relationships to facilitate connections between scholars in Brazil, scholars in part of what we see as a global community of public management. There are lots of people you can connect to around the world. I'm going to make the pitch for why you should think about the Public Management Research Association as a venue to present your work, as a venue to get some sort of feedback in terms of what you're doing. So the association is the sponsor of JPART. JPART is the historically top-ranked journal in the field of public affairs, at least probably in the last 10 or 15 years. And by top-ranked, I mean it's most cited. So it gets more, it has a higher citation impact factor than any other journal. Brad's going to spend a fair bit of time talking about JPART, its history, where it's going. If you're interested in submitting to JPART, are there suggestions about how to publish there or generally? And I expect Carolyn and I will also join in that conversation and listen to the questions you have about that. We are also excited about a new journal that we're starting that will probably not be out publicly until 2018, but we're starting the process of putting it together. This journal is called Perspectives on Public Management and Governance. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is going to be in that journal in a couple of minutes. Another venue where we exchange work is the Public Management Research Conference. This is now an annual conference that occurs within the United States and outside the United States, where 300 to 400 scholars who are interested specifically in public management get together. And I'm going to tell you where the next two conferences are, and I'm going to encourage you to consider to go to those. With any group or organization, there's some defining value that tells you what they believe they're about. I think for us, if you had to boil it down, is we believe we do the best social science research on public management issues. So that sounds very modest, but I think it is true in terms of if you look at the quality of the work that's presented at the conference, when it gets published in JPART, I think it is very good, has gotten better over time. It's a challenging journal to get into precisely because we're interested in raising the standards of quality over time. And we take social science seriously in the field of public management. So a little bit of the origin story behind the association. And so this is the story I've heard from the founding fathers of the association. They were all men at the time, so you can take that for what it's worth. People like Barry Bozeman, Hal Rainey, Brett Millward, Jim Perry, and Hal Rainey again, good measure, and also George Frederickson, who played a key role in creating the association. And so why were they motivated to do this? In the late 1980s, mid-1980s, they looked around at the professional forums that existed for people who did public administration or public management research, and they didn't feel very happy with those. So you could go to the Academy of Management, and there's a public and nonprofit section, and they felt like that didn't completely address their concerns. There's the American Political Science Association, which also has a public administration section. Again, that always felt sort of like a side part, not a very central part of the association. Didn't have a lot of focus on management issues in particular. There's also the American Society for Public Administration, which historically has tended to place a stronger emphasis on reaching out to practitioners than on generating social science. And so all of those places were seen as maybe not completely fulfilling the goal of these people. They said, why don't we start our own association? The first meeting of this group took place in 1991 in Syracuse, and about the same time, George Fredrickson published the first volume of JPAR in 1990. By late 1990s, JPAR had become part of the Public Management Research Association. The conference had become something that was happening every 2 years. The first one was 20 people in Syracuse, and until the late 1990s, it was an invite-only conference. Everyone knew everyone. It was very U.S.-focused, very incestuous, I think is an appropriate term. What was moving the conversation forward in terms of how do we think about public management research. If you move forward to today, the conference looks quite different. So the last couple of conferences that took place in Minnesota and Madison in my hometown had between 350, 400 people. You submit your abstract. It's a blind, peer-reviewed abstract to get in, but it's not invite-only anymore. About 28% of the attendees come from outside the United States. We think this is indicative of a growing shift towards a global public management community. I'm sure Brad will talk about this also. That global element is even more apparent when you look at the journal. The majority of submissions now come from outside the United States. I expect this trend is going to continue moving forward. So we see certain parts of the world very active in our association. I would say Northern Europe, the United Kingdom, Korea, China, I think is quite interested. And we see certain parts of the world that are less engaged with our association, and I would say Brazil and most of South America would fall into that category. And so we think there are some potential opportunities to connect there. Last few years we've run workshops in Asia and in Europe. In the next year we're going to start moving to having a conference outside of the United States every other year. So it'll be US, somewhere outside of the United States, US, somewhere outside of the United States moving forward. This is where the conference is going to be next year in this year, 2016. It's at Aarhus in Denmark. So the deadline for submitting something has passed, unfortunately. But if you are interested in going to Denmark in the summer, if you can do that, it's well worth doing. The registration fee for attendees is $125, so it's not that expensive, or it's $25 for PhD students. And Denmark in the summer is also very nice, a good place to be. I think what this indicates, though, is that we are trying to reach out to parts of the world besides the United States. And we see a very big community emerging, in particular in Northern Europe, do the type of research that we think is good research. And so this is an opportunity for us to go to them rather than expect they always come to the United States each year. In 2017, you could, if you wish, go to UNC Chapel Hill, which will be hosting the conference in June then. You'll notice that these conferences are going to be held on campuses. And so this has been one of the historic trademarks of the association, is that we want universities to host the conference to signal the importance of the academic value of research. And as we get bigger, maybe this becomes more and more difficult, but for now, we think it's important that there is a strong university connection to the association. So in June 2017, if you want to have good barbecue, you can go to North Carolina. Let me transition to the new journal. So you can find information about JPART online. Brad will talk about that. The new journal, PPMG, is motivated by a sense of, I think, the limitations of theory in the field of public management, and creating a venue where we can allow broader discussions of what theory is to occur outside of the traditional journals in our field. And so I'm not going to read the mission statement and the extended description, but as of now, I think we're looking for a very broad discussion on how we think about the role of the state, how we come up with theory to understand that, hopefully theory that's testable empirically, but can also include normative discussions about the nature of the state moving forward. So I think by this summer, the journal will start to take submissions. If people go to Argus this summer, the co-editors will be there and they will talk about their goals for the journals. But to write this down, keep it in mind as a venue if you're working primarily on theoretical issues. I think this is going to be an important journal. We're committed to putting a lot of resources behind it for the next 10 years. Oxford University Press will publish it, and so it'll be placed well in lots of libraries around the world. But we're looking to have a focus that's not just a U.S. or European-centric focus to the work that's published there. This is the editorial team. You'll see there's people from Europe, there's people from the U.S. I think that signals where the association is at the moment, but there's also a broader board of directors that includes, for example, Al-Qaeda and other people from around the world that's a little bit more globally diverse, which signals where we want to go. And so, again, think of this as a venue to look at for the future. The final thing I want to say before we move on to the next section is I think all of us will make reference to our research interests today, and I want you to take all of that with a grain of salt. There are certain research interests that are important to us because we study in a U.S. context, right? And one aspect that I think was reflected in Flavio's talk before I started is the idea that public administration is a field that needs to respond to public sector needs, and the particular context that you work in at a given time should shape the types of research questions that you're asking. So the questions that might be of interest to me, who's studying in North America and is looking at, say, performance issues, might be slightly different questions than the ones that are most relevant to Brazil. A great thing about globalization is that it facilitates both diversity, but the bad thing is sometimes it facilitates hegemony. So globalization gives us lots of different ideas and products from around the world, but sometimes some of those ideas become so dominant that they stomp out room for anything else. So again, I think it's very important for us coming here to hear more about what you think the pressing research issues are in the context of Brazil, and for us to reflect upon that rather than for us to tell you, here is what the research issues that you should focus on should be. So we hope this is going to be a conversation between us, where you have lots of opinions and where you disagree with us, where you tell us where we're wrong about things, where you find connections between what you're thinking about and what we do, rather than something where we're simply just lecturing to you about what the goals of public management research. So should we move on to the next section, or should we take questions at this point? Carolyn?
One thing people might want to know is that, so Don mentioned there's a conference this summer, but that conference you can no longer submit to be on the program, but the second conference in Chapel Hill, you should, most likely this coming fall. So yet this year, they will send out the call for, so we will, if you want to potentially come to that conference, like Don said, we really would love to have more representation from Brazil, South America, and I know we're going to talk about this today, but I think some of the issues you're reckoning with are very much issues that we are addressing globally, so we'd love to have perspective. So I think that if you want to make sure you know and or want to potentially be involved, you can also like give your card to one of us, and we'll make sure that when that call for proposals or for papers comes out, that you know and you can have the opportunity. And actually, it's a fabulous location to go to as well. So just let it be.
Yeah, the call for proposals usually happens around November. And if you are interested in this type of research, it's a lot easier to get into the conference than it is to get into JPAR. So think of that as a good stepping stone to join in the community. I think another interesting aspect of the association is that it has these pre-conference workshops where people who are interested in a particular issue and want to talk about it for a day have a chance to do that. So a couple of years ago, we did have a pre-conference workshop on public management challenges in Europe, in Asia, and in Central and South America. I think there was a lot of scholars from Mexico in particular, and maybe Ricardo was there, but not beyond that, maybe not that many people engaged. But there's also opportunities there to say, we want to have a conversation on particular issues and maybe build a workshop around that rather than simply just a traditional panel. We're always happy to respond to people if they have ideas about this, put them in contact with the right people.
Can I do a quick note though? It's just to talk about the spirit of this workshop, because I mean here are we didn't invite just people from inside the FGV, as I was trying to present, to introduce to all the people. Here there are professors, faculty members from different places in Brazil that make up our community of public administration. People that studied public administration for a long time. Ceci from Rio Grande do Sul. There is a group coming from the Sol, probably they're late. There are people from São Paulo. And there are several former students that graduated and are working several public university, private university in Brazil. So the idea is, I mean, we have those three bright researchers and open-minded researchers. This is, I think, it's a good theme to Bregazel, they've been join us in the past. It's the second time that's here in Brazil. But we want really a conversation, so please jump in anytime you want. It's not a formal debate. We want people to participate, to share their concerns, what seems relevant for public administration research in Brazil that can be of concerns for the world. I mean, that's good, that's good, strong and relevant research in public administration. That's what we're trying to do. Okay? Anyone?
Thank you for inviting us again to talk today. I'm constantly changing titles. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, and I'm fortunate or a little intimidated to do that in front of Carol, the previous editor, and Don was a co-editor for 7 years. I'm going to tell you where I think it is now and my conversations with Craig and Ken and Carolyn and others. And I think that one of the things I want to make clear to you is that JPAR is actually a niche journal in some ways. And there's a lot of very excellent, important research going on that ends up not being published in JPAR because it doesn't fit the mission that my understanding of the journal was created for. And then I'll talk a little bit about things that you might do to take the research you do and also frame it within that niche a little bit better. But I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the journal itself, just basics. We get about last year I think we have roughly about 420 submissions to the journal. This has been growing for about 10 or 15% a year. but we only publish somewhere between 36 and 40, and that's not what we accept. That is what actually comes out in print in a given year. So we get a lot more manuscripts than we can ever publish, and a lot more good manuscripts than we can ever publish. And which is one of the reasons why this niche, my understanding that the journal is sort of created with, ends up even getting more reinforced because of the number of manuscripts that we have to turn away each year. Last year, our acceptance rate was 8%. 92% of the submissions that we got were eventually rejected. Right? So this is a very small acceptance rate. In public administration, it's the smallest. And this is smaller than it has been in the past. Usually it was around somewhere around 10 to 12. This is probably in part because the manuscripts are growing in the public, and the size of the journal isn't. However, we have made some steps recently to try to reformat the journal, add some pages, so that we can at least take off the backlog. Because even with an 8% acceptance rate, we have about a year and a half of manuscripts that are accepted for publication, but have not been published yet. So there's even once you get accepted, it can take a year and a half to 2 years to actually see it in print, though it's online much before then. Of the 420 manuscripts that we got, 46% of the submissions were desk rejected. What that means is that myself or a co-editor sends reviews the manuscript and sends the note to the author saying, this is an interesting topic or a number of other things, but it doesn't fit what we're trying to do with the journal, at least the way it's being framed currently. So those do not go out to review. However, the co-editors and I try to give at least a couple sentences about why we think it's not a good fit and where it might be a better fit. Because we are very proud of JPAR, but at the same time, we feel like there's a lot of really good journals out there. JPAR can't do publish all the good research out there. So a large percentage of them get desk rejected. Of the 38, of the rest of them that we'll send out for review, 70% of the manuscripts we actually send out for review also get rejected by our reviewers. Reviewers give us comments, say we like this, and we think these are some strong things in the manuscript. Here's some concerns we have, some of them about fit, some of them about theory, some about other things. And we don't think that the extent of the revisions that would be required in this paper are within the normal framework, so we're suggesting that you take our comments, improve your paper, perhaps find a venue that would be a better fit for that. And then that leaves us with only about 8% of those that get R&R, so about 16% of the manuscripts that were submitted get R&Rs, the revise and resubmit decisions. And about half of those, once they are either about half of those end up not being published in JPAR, either because people are given a revise and resubmit, and they've decided based on those comments that maybe a different journal would be a better fit. Or they cannot address those comments because sometimes we're asking for different data. So they never resubmit, and others do resubmit, but the reviewers are not fully satisfied with the change that we've made, because this is a very journal of very high demands both on theory and on methods. So even if you get an R&R, there's no certainty that you're going to in this journal. There's no certainty that you will actually get eventually get published, though the chances are much higher. Right? So let's still talk a little bit about the impact of the journal, which has been changing over time. One way we can look at it is the visibility, right? And currently we have in 2008, for example, we had 83,000 full text downloads, where people downloaded either the PDF or the full text of articles that year, and we had over 200,000 downloads of abstracts from our articles. 2004, the number of abstracts increases a little bit, about 40%, but we now have twice as many downloads. So here are people accessing these articles fully online, and we see a huge increase in this. We can also look at the impact factor, which is the number of times on average an article published in JPAR is cited within a specified period of time. And again, you see sort of a trend in this, where a few years ago the 2-year impact factor was 1.5, so that means within the first 2 years of being published, roughly within the first 2 years of being published, an article in our journal gets cited at least 1.5 times. And that in our field of public administration is quite good. In other fields, if you go into psychology, sociology, you see that is not necessarily a high one, but we are doing better here. A 5-year impact factor, which is probably a better factor indicator to use for a social science journal like our own, was 2.5 essentially. So within the first 5 years, an article on average would be publicly cited 2.5 times. If you look at 2014, we see a huge increase in both of these numbers. In fact, if we were a political science journal, we would be, in public administration, we're ranked number 1. So we have the highest 2-year impact factor since 2013, so we're reigning champions several years in a row. Highest 5-year impact since 2009. If we were a political science journal, we'd be within the top 5. We'd be right up there with JPS and Journal of Politics. So one of the things is not only are we a top-cited journal with a high impact factor in public administration, but the journal is becoming more prominent outside of public administration. We're seeing the field get more citations and having more visibility than we did before. And that's really one of the missions behind why the journal was created, which I'll speak to in a minute. My computer died last night, so I have a few slides that may be a little duplicative that I wasn't able to complete.
Fine. Which of this indicator do you think is the best one to use? Is the first, the 2 years or the 5 years?
My view is that the 5 years is actually a better indicator for social science journals. So when they created this impact factor, their idea was this is going to be driven by hard sciences. In the hard sciences, after 2 years, your article's rarely cited that much. Right? So if you come up with a new insight on cancer, your article gets cited a lot in the first 6 months. And then after a while, it gets cited less and less because there's new impact, there's new insights that have long-term impact, right? Those are fast-moving fields. In the social sciences, it's a much slower-moving field. In fact, in the hard sciences, you might go from submitting an article to being published in print within a few months. In the social sciences, as I'm sure all of you have experienced the frustration, it can take 2 years to get it accepted for publication, and another 1.5 years to get it in print. So this is a better one, but the industry standard is to use this one. They report them both, but if you go to our website, or our journal websites, you'll see this cited more often because that is still the industry standards.
Okay. Thank you.
Looking at that, it's rather discouraging in the sense that what I was thinking here, what are the chances we have of in publishing challenges of public administration in a country like us? We would have to have some intersection with the same interest with other researchers so that it would be relevant. But a country like us, we have problem of fighting poverty, we have inclusion in education, and we have challenges of quality, creating quality in education for people who do not get well fed. And it doesn't seem to have an intersection point with the interest of more than European or even North American researchers. How do you see that?
Well, I think Carolyn will talk a little bit about that.
I think it's very squarely in. So I have about research on exactly these issues that was just published, Advanced Access with JPART right now, and this is an area I've worked on for years now. And so education, like you said, poverty, all these issues, I think they're very relevant. And I think when I get to my talk, I'm going to go through what some of the themes are. We'll talk specifically about, and so we can have more interactive conversation. Because I think this is part of what we can do through our conversations today is help you see the relevance to those themes. And part of it is when you write your manuscript, how you tie what your context is in to these larger issues. And so we are saying we welcome research coming out of other contexts where things may be different in how you see them in Brazil, but we think they are very relevant to the core issues of public administration. So everything you said, I think we could say is yes, that's relevant to what we would like to publish in the journal.
So let me add to that. So Carolyn's paper that was just published is situated in South Africa.
Yeah.
So that's the empirical context. But the theoretical framing is you use administrative burden as a theoretical frame. So it doesn't really matter where the empirical location is. In some ways, having a non-traditional empirical location is a plus. But the story can't be just about the location. The story has to fit within some broader theoretical frame. So I spent a lot of time in Denmark, and I think they also used to struggle with the same issues. They kept putting Denmark in the title of their paper or in their abstracts because they thought, oh, this is a Denmark paper. And they figured out over time it's not a Denmark paper. It's about administrative burden, or it's about public service motivation, or it's about implementation issues, and the empirical context is in Denmark. So it's making the link between what you're studying and the broader discussion that's already occurring within the journal. So if you can find, oh, you look at previous issues, there's a theory here that really speaks to the issues I'm talking about. You have to hook onto that, I think.
And I think it's also another important thing to be considered, which are the public sector reforms that go around from one place to another place. So, I mean, there is, if you talk about the practice of the public service and public sector, there is a lot of conversation going on. I mean, everybody talks about public-private partnerships, non-profits, conditional cash transfers, it's going on not just in Brazil, it's going on in other places around the world. So we have another important question to consider that comes from the issues that emerge from the public sector itself. And probably this is an important gap to be also strengthened.
And so some of the things I'm going to talk about here is JPARC's specific mission and how things can be framed for JPARC. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of very high quality research that's important that wouldn't be a good fit for the mission that JPARC was created for, which it was, I'm going to sort of simplify it a little bit, probably maybe oversimplify it, but JPARC was in part created to give academic legitimacy to the field, right? So if you are describing something that's happening in Brazil or in the United States, if you're describing a specific policy, or you're doing a program evaluation, or you're saying what's happening within a specific agency, even in the US, if you're doing that, that's not a good fit. We don't want something that describes. We want something that explains. And not just something that explains what happens in a small agency in the United States, but something you use the agency in the United States as a way of testing a broader theory or a broader expectation that we see public administration scholars around the world having. And that's just a specific test of a broader theory. So at the end of the day, when someone reads from this, we learn a little bit of what's going on in a small agency or in a different country, but mostly what we're learning is we're advancing an academic theory in a new way, perhaps using data from a particular set. Right. So I have some stuff on this, and there's a lot of journals out there that are still interested in looking at what happens in a specific agency or learning more about what government is like in a particular country. Those are important topics, and there are a lot of journals already doing that. And that's why when JPARC was created, it was created with a different niche. Right? And I can talk a little bit about strategies you might take.
I'm sorry, it's just a little bit this point, but a slightly different perspective. I don't think the problem is finding the point of intersection in terms of the issues. I think, of course, the issues are very plural, and you mentioned that before, how interesting it would be to find specific relevant issues for each location. I think there is a major problem of theory. Those of us who have published or tried to publish in foreign journals, especially in global north, it's very common where we face lots of difficulties. The language barrier, we have to explain our context much more than a person in US or in Europe who have to explain the context, and this is required from us and not from people in the global north, and so on and so forth. But I think there is a major issue of also theoretical framework. Because it needs, in order to speak to a certain readership, in order to be relevant and to be interesting to a certain readership, it's expected from us to establish a dialogue. And I'm totally okay with that. But then, when we try to include also authors that are Brazilian authors that speak from our perspective, that understand our reality, that have really developed from our to reality, I think we struggle a lot to show and to present and to justify how relevant it could be. So I wonder if you or later we could talk more about how plural and how does this dialogue happens in the journal and the community as a whole. How do you see these different theoretical influences rather than just keeping focused on a certain?
Yeah, I have some things that I have on that, and I'm sure Carolyn has, I think, probably been talking about that a little bit. So I think that's what the whole day, my hope will be about. And what I want to do when I talk about the journal, even in the United States, when I go talk about the journal, everyone says, why don't you care about my research in your journal? And it's not my journal, it's the association. And I don't make these decisions. I do, I have some influence over them. But a lot of the practices of the journal were about how it was set up in the beginning, and that Carolyn and Craig Thomas and I are just sort of implementing this vision for this journal. And if you don't get into this journal, it doesn't mean that your work's not important. Most of my research doesn't get into this journal. My last 3 submissions to this journal were actually rejected, and that's why I became the editor. So, one of the problems with becoming a journal that has been so successful like JPAR is you get this expectation that I hear this from deans in the U.S. and outside the U.S. They tell me, we don't give someone tenure unless they publish in JPAR. And my argument to them is that's the dumbest thing, one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, up until this whole thing with Trump. It was probably because JPAR has a specific niche. There's a lot of really good research out there that doesn't fit that niche. And there's other good research out there that could fit that niche, but like Carolyn says or Don said, might need to be framed to fit that niche, right? Because JPAR is very sort of, it's very sort of narrow. Now, if we didn't have these other journals, then JPAR would have been built to do these other things, right? So public administration review, for example, tries to satisfy 2 audiences, practitioners and academics. So each piece now, you'll see these little academic, or these practitioner pieces, the practitioner points at the top of each piece. JPAR cares about practice, but it's not our thing. Our thing is about academic theory, right? And our audience is not for practitioners, it's academic theorists and researchers writing for academic theorists and researchers. So Jim Perry at Public Administration Review likes to talk about, when I was a co-editor under him for a while, likes to talk about JPAR, or PAR being the New England Journal of Medicine, right? Doctors and researchers read that journal. JPAR was created to be science or nature, right? It has a lot of different topics, but it's written by engineers writing for engineers, other engineer scientists, or cancer doctors writing for other cancer cancer researchers writing for other cancer researchers. It's not really written for cancer doctors. Right? So there is that balance, but we're only doing that because there are other journals out there doing the other.
But I would also say that it is still relevant what the vocations of your work are for practitioners.
Yeah.
So I mean, like that is something that we were talking to someone earlier here that you're looking for policy levers, right, to change. And so I think the research that identifies through that, here are things that where you can take action. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the piece I'm doing today. But I think another reason why we're here is because we realize that building collaborative networks and bridges, we can kind of transfer and talk with people about like the research you do and give you insights. So we correspond with you or collaborate with you, and we can learn from, like you were saying, the theorists that you typically draw on. Where might be even the intersections between theories and the way you typically think of things, and what's commonly, referred to or drawn on in these journals, and I think making those connections. So I feel like I do feel in terms of Brazil, because I'll talk later, I've done, I did a lot of work here earlier, over like a 7-year period. I think you have many fruitful areas in which you connect very strongly with current themes, and maybe even in partnerships or coming to the conference in 2017, even if you wouldn't get on the program, to come there, go to sessions, hear about that, and then as you sit there, think about how does my work fit in. And that's another way to kind of get in and see that, but I think there's many rich contributions to come from this country to our field.
And perhaps in retrospect, it might have made sense to have Carolyn sort of go first talking about the sort of topics, and then I would talk a little bit more about the journal and how it fits in the journalism field. And there's some overlap. But maybe we are putting the cart before the horse a little bit here, or a very specific cart. But let me continue with some broad trends, and then we'll come back to some of those questions. So as Don pointed out earlier, the journal itself is becoming much more globalized, intentionally so. So if you look at submissions or subscriptions, people who actually have access to the journal as individual subscriptions, only 39% of them are from North America, right? So most of the people who get the journal are outside the United States. If you look at the places where people have access to the journal through their libraries and consortiums, only a quarter of the scholars and students who have access to the journal now are from North America. The rest are from the other room. I pulled this from Oxford's report. ROW is not a new country. It's what they call the rest of the world. I wish they would split this up a little bit more. I don't know why Japan gets its own little slice. Because we get no submissions from Japan, but you can see that it's no longer an American journal, a North American journal. It still has a bias there, certainly, but it's less so. When you look at submissions, so I did not steal this. I made this last night before my computer died, so hopefully it doesn't look as bad as I fear it might. If we look at just the submissions of manuscripts last year, it's still heavily from North America. And yes, I'm meaning North America. We do get Canadian submissions too, and I'm counting them here. Right? So about 44% of the manuscripts that are submitted to us every year come from North America. That's very different than it was probably 10 years ago, or even 5 or 6 years ago. It's a much smaller number. We get a lot from Europe. We get some from and a lot from Asia. We have some from South and Central America. Last year we had 7 submissions from Brazil, which was the biggest contingent from here, from this particular group. However, if we look at who gets published, it is still a little biased. And part of this is about the framing more than maybe about the topic. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So if we look at the manuscripts that were accepted since in the last 14 months, 63% of them come from North America. Again, that includes Canada. And a third of them come from Europe. Now again, this is different from what it was 5 or 10 years ago, where it would probably be 80 or 90% coming from North America. And then we would include Canada in that, because there were Canadians publishing at that time in the big part. If I even look more specifically, I look at just the manuscripts that were accepted, that were submitted last year and have already been accepted. Nearly 60% of them are from outside the U.S. So the trend is continuing that it's less and less about a North American journal. However, it still has a framework and an audience, a mission statement that people have to learn how to get to sort of appeal to if you want to get into this specific journal given its mission. And as Don mentioned, a lot of Europeans were also very frustrated a number of years ago trying to get into this particular journal, but they've now realized the way to frame these manuscripts in a way that people outside of Denmark and outside of the Netherlands, outside the UK, will find maximum value in them.
Right. They come to the conferences too now.
They do. The conference attendance is I think, almost 40 or something percent outside of the U.S. So the trend here is globalization. We still are heavily dominated in the actual publications from the North American side, but these are individuals who read the journal, who when they submit things, they fit within the framework of that journal, or not just that journal, but what the journal is trying to do. It doesn't mean you always have to cite the process.
In terms of just percentage from Europe, how much does it come from UK?
Almost none. Last in these numbers, there are one from the UK. we have 3 from Denmark, and surprisingly 2 from Germany, which I didn't, you'd think I'd be paying attention to this, but I'm not. Only when I'm asked to summarize this do I realize this. We had Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Italy, Austria. So only 1 from the UK on this, in this 14, 15 months.
Wonder about the relationship with the language.
Yes, you would think, right? Because they would have a language advantage because they claim that they speak English better than Americans. This whole Z thing trips me off, the extra U's. But you would think, but really a large part of this is really very, like, almost all this is non-English speaking countries. So they are figuring out the language thing. But again, I know a lot of people from Denmark that speak English better than I do too. So. Yeah. Okay. A couple other things. So when I took over as the editor, I went back and looked at every article that was desk rejected for the last 3 years, read the letters and looked at the manuscript to look for trends. And these trends continue under the time that I've been an editor, and I've been meeting with the co-editors quite frequently to talk about every other year at the meetings, but then also email to talk about these trends, to see whether or not we want to change some of these. And they feel very comfortable with the kinds of decision making we're making with the desk rejection. These are manuscripts that right away either myself or a co-editor reads, finds interesting, might even like it, sometimes say it's a very good piece, but it doesn't fit what we try to do with this specific journal. And in which case, like I said, we tend to give people advice about where they might consider it, to the extent that and where they might consider sending it to. So these are really sort of the main things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about readability because you'd be surprised the number of times we get a manuscript from a U.S. citizen or someone from the UK, and the reviewers go, this needs, obviously it's someone whose English is a second language, they need to learn how to write in English, and it's actually like me, or something, or that's the only language I know. So readability is important, and some of that is about the language, and some of it's about how you organize the information. Methodological rigor is important. We're seeing a big push now for more and more experimental research. For survey research, it's more difficult to try to publish because you've seen the stuff published in the articles that have come out looking about social desirability bias, about common method bias, about the difficulties of using research when you're asking people to assess their own performance, for example. So there are a number of trends that here too, I'm not going to necessarily talk about those either. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about these two. I'm going to talk about in terms of our journal, because in our journal we don't want you to describe, we want you to explain. And we want to explain things in ways that we not only know what's going on in Brazil, but then we can take the knowledge you just gave us of Brazil and we can see how it adds to our knowledge of other places. So these are the two that I'm really going to focus on. There's going to be some cutbacks to the other occasion. So this is our mission statement, right, Jay Hart. Oh,
Hi. Let me ask a question. When you say that actually you want a contribution, you want a theoretical aspect, right? You said it has to be more than just like telling how it happens. It's like, well, explain why it happens, and you have a theoretical framework that's solid, and you want to add things that contribute to the rest of the work. So this is all nice, but how do you attract your attention as editors in the very first paragraph, in the very first part that says like, look, I'm adding to theory and my work is this and this and this. How would you recommend us to do so that we catch your attention in the first sentence or the first paragraph and you say, okay, I want to get to the end and say this is actually adding to the thing, even if it's, maybe not, but like to be in the, at least the 10% or 8% of the stuff.
And I don't have an easy answer to that, but I do have 8 slides that talk about that.
And I think Carolyn and I can also add to that conversation.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it. Again, that's a great question. That is really the frame of what we were hoping to accomplish today. So let me see if I answer some of that in the other slides, and then you can come back and ask, again, if I did this. So if you look at the mission statement of the journal, it reads a specific way. I'm not going to read this for you, but you look at this and you can interpret it a specific way. So a lot of people will read this and say, okay, when you're looking at policy sciences, so obviously you care about policy analysis, policy process, policy design. We don't. Not directly, not primarily, right? So, and we may have done more of that earlier on, but under Craig and then with me, we don't do as much.
Practical question. Can you left your presentation for us to check later, or we need to copy?
It's on the hard drive here, so if someone can make that available to you, that's fine. This is on the website. What I'm going to say here is that when we have our mission statements, the journals have their mission statements online. Our individual interpretations of this mission statement may not match the practical, the in practice interpretation of the mission statement. So one of the things that I recommend you do when you look at any journal to submit to is just grab a year or two of that journal, flip through it, and see what kinds of stuff they publish. Not just the type of methods they use, but the topics they have. There's a whole number of reasons for that. The framing that they use. And I'm going to take each of these paragraphs, sentences, and I'm going to then interpret how it has seemed to work under at least Craig, because I was a co-editor under Craig for a while, and myself, more often than not. And when I do this in the U.S., I warn you now, people get very mad at me. They think I've changed JPART and made the world a different place, or I don't care about the research. My goal here isn't to tell you what your research should be. My goal is to tell you what the research in JPART we tend to take is, and it's not necessarily the most important approach, right? It's just what JPART does, right? If we were the only journal in public administration, we would do something different, but this is the niche that was created here. So, for example, if we just take this one where we're a bridge between public administration, public management, and public policy, that suggests we might be interested in a lot of things to do with public policy. In fact, I think the last I checked, our impact factor is higher than JPAM, the Journal of Public Policy and Management. So we get a lot more policy people submitting to the journal all the time. And in fact, we do publish work for policy people, but it's the specific type of work that we tend to publish more than others. So one thing we do, for example, is we tend to publish, our primary interest in policy is on policy implementation, not policy process, policy analysis, or program evaluation. So if you're evaluating a program and there's some lessons to learn from that, if those lessons are about implementation and you can frame it within a theory testing that might be attractive to scholars from outside Brazil or outside the US, then that's what we're looking for. But we get a lot of pieces where it talks about how you might, we got a wonderful piece about how you can increase, how you can run an ad campaign to increase the amount of pork eating in Iran. Again, I think that that is a very interesting, probably important study, but we don't do something about policy, and probably many people, policy design work is not primarily what we do, and most of our readers probably wouldn't take a lot of lessons away from this that they can apply in their own area, right? Because it's very specific.
So it also doesn't mean that research you've done associated with a particular program evaluation couldn't be ultimately. So the piece I'm going to talk about later, literally I worked for 5 years on, it was an impact evaluation, but what we draw out of that is the policy implementation tied to theory issues. And so again, you can take work that you've invested in like that, and it's how you frame it or what you're interested in that piece of it that can still get published here.
Yeah, so you can find a very good journal of public administration that's very interested in the Brazilian aspect. Another one might be interested in the actual evaluation, what you find in this. And we would be the ones that are interested in, okay, what does this tell us about implementation theory in general? So you have one project, but you get multiple, you write multiple articles that have some similar core, but they're each talking to a different audience with a different form. Right? This is another one in the U.S. I get all kinds of trouble for. It says we're a multidisciplinary to advance organization, administrative, and policy sciences. It applies to government and governance. In this case, in the U.S., there's a lot more research looking at nonprofit organizations, and most of the public administration programs have courses dealing with nonprofit organizations. If you go to the Public Management Research Conference, there's going to be a lot of research there that is being presented that looks almost solely at nonprofit organizations. Our journal doesn't tend to publish that. We publish things that look at nonprofits, but only when they have a very strong government angle. Right? And this is, again, something that's been going on for a number of years. It was, I don't know if Carolyn, were you doing that? I know Craig was doing it. So we do publish some things that have to deal with nonprofits, just as we publish some things that do with watersheds and networks. But our interest isn't the watersheds. Our interest, or the environmental aspect, our interest is on what the organizations dealing with the environmental watersheds in the U.S. teach us about networks in general, right? So we don't do a lot of nonprofits, and we don't do things, we tend not to publish things when your sample is primarily from the private sector, or solely from the private sector, though we do have some interest in sector comparison stuff if it advances theory.
And you might do like public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
There's a whole
Yeah.
range of very interesting things on that is very much central to it.
So we do, David Van Slyke's a co-editor, does a lot of stuff on contracting, public-private partnerships. And, you know, if you submit something on those topics, I send it to David. And he tells me whether or not he thinks it's a good fit here, and sometimes he says, it's not a good fit here, but you know what? I'm a co-editor at this other journal, where I think it would be a better fit, because this other journal is less theory-focused, and it's more about lessons learned that aren't necessarily framed within a broader academic theory. This is another aspect, is the final one, looking at diverse and rigorous scholarship. Now, we're all going to define this a little differently. As I told you, there's trends in JPART now. A number of articles looking at the potential biases when looking at survey data or common method bias, the importance of doing experimental or better field quasi-experimental work. We're not necessarily tied into a specific type of method, but 65% of our articles that have been published in the last few years are quantitative, and often, very quantitative. We're talking about econometric models and other kinds of things, not just simple OLS regressions. About 20% comes from is qualitative research. So we have Sonia Espena, who's done a lot of work here in Brazil. She's and Stephanie Moulton, who look at the qualitative research because they're better trained in that than I. That stuff is picky. It turns out qualitative people are very picky about the research. Maybe even more picky than quantitative. But about 20% of our articles are qualitative in nature, and about 15% might be considered theory only. That is very hard to get published in JPART. And in part because in theory only work, you're often trying to convince people trying to convince other scholars that the way they've been thinking about the world all these years is wrong, and you're only doing it with logic and not data, right? And that can be hard to do in an audience that likes to have both. So we do some of that with JPART. And one of the things with this new journal is to try to push people to create an editorial team and others that will help try to expand the ideas of the field even better than what JPART does with idea-only kinds of stuff. So we publish some of that, but it is a little harder in our field to do it, in our journal to do it the way our review pool tends to react. So here, the primary criterion for publication in JPART is whether it makes a significant theoretical contribution to public administration that is going to have a broad appeal to scholars, not just in the U.S., but outside the U.S. This turns out to be a very heavy standard, right? And very subjective, but we do try to use 3 reviewers and a co-editor or an editor to try to determine, so if one reviewer really, really dislikes the theory, the other 2 are very excited by it, then there's still some wiggle room there. We don't try to do it off the views of one specific individual, but again, ultimately there's going to be some subjectivity to this. But this tells us that good data is not enough here. We want good data if you're going to publish quantitative pieces. piece or even a qualitative piece. But doing a very strong method and having really good data is not enough to get published in JPAR. You've got to, it's enough to get published in a really good journal somewhere, but not this journal. So we don't do a lot of measurement stuff or empirical. We've published a few things in the last few years that have looked at what I would call methods pieces. They're trying to argue that a specific method is the appropriate way to go for certain circumstances, or developing a measurement tool for like public service motivation. Most of that work is published as part of a symposium. So they get, that's a group of research that doesn't go through the normal process that I'm talking about here, and we're doing less and less of those. And others of that, like a project I worked on with 12 different countries on public service motivation measurement, and Don, I think, was the co-editor of this, and he was not easy to deal with. That's why I kicked him off when I became editor. He kept pushing back on us. This is an important, measurement is very, very important. But we don't do measurement-only pieces. If you want this published in JPAR, you've got to talk about the measurement and then some theoretical lessons for the measurement. So that article is partly framed around the fact that when we look at public service motivation, and we go to 12 different countries, and we get scholars from 12 different countries to develop a measure and to test it in 12 different countries, we find out that public service motivation doesn't mean the same thing in every country. There are important cultural differences, and there are patterns in those cultural differences. And in the UK and Australia and the US, there are very similar definitions of what public service motivation might be, conceptual framing for that. When you go outside that, when you look at Asia and others, you see more differences, even in some areas of Europe. So the framework of that study, even though it started off as a measurement piece, just developing a scale, ended up being one about testing cultural differences and the meaning of an important concept in our field, at least in some areas. So again, there's an example where we started with a framework of something that could get desk rejected or get rejected, and we made it, we fit it to make it fit the audience and the purpose of this journal.
Yeah, in this material, strong theoretical contribution, I was thinking about what kind of novelty are you looking for in a piece of paper? Because currently I'm working with a project based on a paper released last year on this journal, which basically I see that the theory might not hold in our current case, and there is a lot of interactions that I can prove the causal mechanism behind the piece of interest. But that basically is building upon a paper already published on the journal, a lot of theory. So do you guys look for always something extremely, what level of novelty would you need to have to publish in the journal?
Some of that is going to be ultimately determined by the expert reviewers. So the co-editors or myself will look at it and see whether we think you might be adding theoretical contribution. And if we think even if you might be, or even if we're not so sure you are, we think it's possible, we'll send it out to expert reviewers in that field, and then they're going to make some judgment on it. And again, we'll send it out to more than one. But there are some sort of ways you might classify the themes, and I have a couple thoughts on that might answer that question, I hope, but you might be looking for something a little more specific. But I'm trying to think of like broad ways of saying how you might do this without using such a narrow way that it won't fit for everyone. So a couple quick things about fit, and then I'm going to get to those slides. Start off by reviewing the journal mission, but don't end there. What you really need to do is look at what they publish. You know, pick up the. I remember when I was in grad school, I was really excited about JPAM, Journal of Public Policy and Management, Policy Analysis and Management. One of the professors there was retiring, so he put 10 years of it in a pile on a desk in the hall, and I grabbed all 10 years. It's free magazines, right? Put it in my room. I was going to really impress people with my library. And then I thumbed through there, and I found over 10 years 3 articles I had any interest in at all. And I realized that its definition of management and my definition of management, being trained by a psychologist, is different. Right? Not that the work in that journal wasn't very important. It just wasn't going to fit real well with what I was interested in and my own research. So you have to go beyond the mission to look at what they published, And then when you write your paper, when you're done writing your paper, look at what you have cited. Now don't start by going, I want to publish in Public Administration Review, so I'm going to cite all kinds of Public Administration Review stuff. Write the paper like you think it needs to be written, and then look at where you've cited it. I mean, if you have not, we get a number of there's a really good article on public-private partnership that got submitted the other day by economists, a couple of economists in Europe, and I gave it to David Van Slyke. And David is actually his master's degree is in economics. He loved the piece, but the problem with it is it had some interesting things, but it didn't speak to our audience. It only cited econ pieces, econ research, and it only talked about it from an econ way. So we publish it in JPARC, and people like me would read it and go, I don't even know, I'm not positive what it's saying, and I'm not so sure how it impacts what I think I know about public-private partnership in the literature that I've been reading. So I don't know what it, I don't see how it relates to my research. So one of the things you have to do is, if you look at what you're citing, that's probably the audience that you're writing your paper for. Right? But you can also then say, I really want to write this for JPARC. How do I take my story and fit it into the research that public administration scholars tend to read and the framework that they use, the jargon that they use? I don't have to not cite econ journals. I don't have to not talk about it from an economist standpoint. But I do have to make it accessible to people who aren't economists.
I was just going to add another way of thinking about this is whatever you're writing on, where's that conversation happening in journals, right? So where are the other, so it's a similar way you're saying, going and looking at where people have published that, but then look at, where are those recent publications, and then it doesn't mean if that's not happening in JPARC, you couldn't do it there, but you want to make sure you can plug into that, because then it's...
Yeah, I think that one scholar that submitted the article about advertising campaigns and increasing pork eating, I think if he flipped through our journal, we realized that that's conversation's not occurring in the journal. But there are some drawbacks to that too. We do a lot of research. A lot of the networks individuals, a lot of the network scholars are doing work on environment, and a lot of them are doing work with watershed groups. So we get ecologists submitting stuff to JPAR all the time that do cite JPAR articles, but they're not really talking about theory. They're only talking about watersheds. They're really still being written, even though they cite JPAR. They're still being written for environmental scholars. So there's no simple rule, but these are some things, some rules of thumb to start thinking about. So how then might we think about the theoretical framing? A couple of things that are important is, in general, our reviewers really like theory. Right? They take the idea that the Journal of Public Administration research and theory very important, but theory is a very important part of it. So it's not uncommon that once it passes the co-editors and the editors and sent out to review, that the reviewers have concerns about the theory part. To be honest, I was trained a bit differently, but when I was picking up public administration review journals or other things, we don't do much with theory. We tend to describe things, but we don't tend to explain them, right? So one of the things I encourage you to think about is that theory is more than just citations and saying what other people have found, right? We have to tell a story. And there are some really wonderful resources from the Academy Management Journal, Academy Management Review. They have a website on this, what this theory is and what it's not, what constitutes theories, grounding hypothesis. Adam Grant, a co-author of mine, and a few others have pieces on this where it talk about how you sell a story. How do you not just give a research report, but how you tell a story around that report that brings the reader in and goes, I can see your theory. Based on what you're expecting to find, I'm almost half convinced. And then when I see your data, I'm fully convinced, or at least enough convinced. Right? So one thing is the underdeveloped theory here, and I just want to point that out when I spend a little bit of time on it, but the slides will be available.
So one point about theory is that we often have different conceptualizations of what theory is. My sense is that in this particular journal, theory is mostly about causal relationships. X causes Y and Y. Right, yeah, what's the causal mechanism that's occurring, and explain that to us. That, you know, that might be a good or a bad thing, but that's where we've sort of evolved into in the journal. And that's also partly why we're starting another journal, because there are other forms of theoretical development.
Can we go back on the other side? There was another point that Brad has on here I think is really important is when you do your literature review to kind of frame your piece, it's not just a matter of making sure you say what everybody else has said. When you come out of that section, we should know why the things you cited were important to your theory development, and then where are you going with it? What is your added value of your contribution based on where the field is theoretically? So again, not just as like, oh, I've put all the main pieces and summarized the literature, but why was that important, and why is it important to your piece in particular, as well as to how this contributes to the field more broadly?
I have, I think, a couple other thoughts on that, which fits into what Carolyn and Don were just saying, making clear how your paper fills a gap. Too often we get papers in J. Park that says, or Power, when I was quoted there, that says, my paper is important because my topic is important and no one has studied what I've studied before. No one probably studies whether or not putting a pickle in your ear solves cancer. Doesn't mean that that's a justification for studying it here. So just because no one has done it before is not a really good reason that we need to start now. So what you need to do is convince us no one has done it before, but they should have for these reasons. Right? Small contributions and validation studies are very important. They need to get published, need to be out in the field, but it's not what JPARC does. Right? And again, it's not because the main reason why it's not what JPARC does is there's already other fields. A lot of other journals that already existed before JPARC was created. And JPARC was created to do something different, right? It's meant to be science or nature. Academics writing for other academics, and that's why one of the reasons why our impact factor is so high. Okay, I already said that. So let's talk about framing this contribution. Come back here, right? One thing that we see a lot is we take an old idea and we develop it in a new country. So we might look at what performance management, there's a lot of discussion on that, and we might say, here's a piece on performance management, how it's happening in the Philippines. That's interesting, probably deserving of publication. It's not really what JPARC does, right? Because to be published in JPARC, you must show how that variability in that setting, how the approach that the Philippines are taking adds additional insights or boundary conditions to something we already know. We might think that, for example, like public service motivation is something I study, which is sort of how government and nonprofit employees often can be motivated in their jobs because they tend to be more altruistic. They want to make the world a better place. And they're less motivated for the money because in a lot of countries, the money and prestige is not associated with nonprofit or government employment as much. My housemate, my best friend for 20 years, he's from Brazil. He tells me this theory is very normative in Brazil. Because a lot of people will go for work for government like he did because that's where the money is and that's where the prestige is. So it should be about helping others. But the way this is set up in Brazil, it's less about that than it should be. So again, what we're having here is we can have a theory about what, a broader theory that's of interest to a lot of individuals, and then talk about how the setup, the context, the culture in another country suggests an insight to the theory where it's not always true. It's not always true in a way that we might learn, we might take the lessons from that and extrapolate other places. There are government jobs in the U.S., like janitors and secretaries, where you have more, you get more external rewards, you get better pay, you get a little more prestige probably when you work, on average, when you work in government. So to say that you're a janitor or your secretary and working in government in the U.S. is driven by public service motivation may not be true. You're driven by, but that's the highest paying secretarial job they can find, right? So again, a lesson learned very clearly in one setting then can add insights in other settings. Another thing that we get is we might see something where it's comparing two countries. Well, this is what U.S. scholars say or what U.S. agencies do, and here's what we do in Philippines. and I didn't realize Philippines was part of it, but I'm just thinking of Philippines because I noticed we had a submission from the Philippines that I didn't realize. Okay, I didn't ignore it, I just didn't realize it was from the Philippines. That in itself is not enough to compare two countries. That's enough to it's enough to make some important contributions somewhere, and it's certainly enough to get published in certain journals, but for this journal, again, with very specific view, it's not enough. What you would need to do here is develop new and interesting ideas why the differences between these two countries might challenge important assumptions that we have in ways that provide insights to both of these countries or other countries. Right? Again, it's about framing this about the lessons learned outside of the specific context. And I think about this really as sort of like three different approaches you might take. There's probably more, but these are three I stole from an editor of, I think, Administrative Science Quarterly or something, and when he was talking about his insights about theory. One, we do consensus shifting. This is about taking something that's a widely accepted theoretical assumption and challenge this. My work in public service motivation has done a lot of this. Because when I first got interested in it, I thought the theory had some truth to it, but the way it was used was all wrong. I still feel that way. And most of my research is not actually all that positive on public service motivation. It's saying, we're thinking about this wrong. What value there is over here and not over there. There's consensus creation, where you're identifying two literatures or two ideas, two theories, two sets of findings that seem to conflict, and come up with a theory about why this conflict can add insight, why it exists, right? And what might be the theoretical implications of that existing. So in organization behavior, which is my background, there was in the goal-setting theory, there was research that suggested that you could set the goals for your employees, and it's just as powerful as when they get to set their own goals. And then there was another whole group of researchers that said, when you set your own goals, it's much more powerful than when your manager sets your goals. And you had these two streams of research very much disagreeing with each other. They got together and actually did group research together. And what they found out is the individuals, the scholars who were doing the research saying that you can set your own goals and it's effective, they were doing a sell and tell approach. Here's the goal I have for you as an employee and why it's important. And when you do it that way, it's very similar to as if you set your own goals, right? So they found why these two groups that were fighting, they found why their two pieces of why their research conflicts in a way that actually adds insight to the theory.
Listening to you now and thinking on organizational behavior, that's pretty much my theme. What I've been noticing on North American publications is a very strong preference for what I call individualistic methodology, or understanding individuals as isolated atoms and trying to understand how is it that you can make that approach, right? As an anthropologist, I think there is a general trend to undervaluate the true impact of symbolic and cultural anthropology in shaping behavior. And in this sense, I see somehow of theoretical bias and what would be somehow a type of political bias on the way you use theory. You would say that you could have followed this track in trying publishing in your journal?
Well, I would argue that just as you're pointing out the biases that people are taking in their OP work, that you also have.
Yeah.
You all have a bias. So I just found out the sociology department is in the same building I am at the University of Georgia, and I'm the department head there, and I was talking to one of the other department head sociologists, and she referred to herself as a social psychologist. I said, you cannot be a social psychologist because you are not a psychologist. And then she told me she does experiments. It's like, you can't be doing experiments because you're a sociologist. Sociologists don't do experiments. So I had this preconceived idea of what sociology was that was right maybe sometimes, but not other times. And what I found out is they do think about how my training with psychology, I'll look at culture and its effects, but I look at the culture's effects on individuals. And then I miss out on how the culture can have a reinforcing effect in groups, where the groups sort of create their own culture, and it's the interaction between individuals that create this. And that's why there are other people that take that approach. So there is, for example, there's a piece coming out by Brandon Noel, who is, her background is in community psychology. And she has a piece coming out that challenges this idea of public service motivation. And she challenges it's not necessarily an individual phenomenon, it's a community phenomenon, right? So she's sort of challenging this idea that we see this as something to study at an individual level. And that's coming out in JPAR. So you're right, I think the pieces that are coming out in JPAR looking at OB are much more from an individual IO psych background, and less from like a sociology or social psychology.
Preference for methodological influence.
Yeah. Well, it's not that we're not open to that, but again, if you look at Journal of Applied Psychology and other things, you still see that same bias, right? So we all have some kind of methodological and other bias, theoretical biases, because that's our background, the way training we've done.
I'm asking that because when I observe the challenges we have now in implementing public policies in Brazil, we have a very strong, strong challenge in creating good internal coalition guided coalition. And it's a problem, a clear problem of a lack of legitimacy of power schemes. And then you would go very much into very classic sociological analysis and very classic anthropological analysis, trying to understand how this lack of legitimacy work and how is it that it threatens internal coalition. You wouldn't clearly fit in methodological individualism.
Well, I think when you look at a lot of the network stuff being published in the JPAR and public administration journals, you will see more of a sociological approach, where they see it's the interactions between members of those networks that can create that legitimacy under certain conditions, and is less likely to create that legitimacy under other conditions. So that research is, I think, being done. Whether it's always being done in the area that you want, that's this third one, perhaps, right? Now, these are very hard things to deal with, but because you have to convince people who are writing on a topic who have a certain set of beliefs to be more open-minded than I might want to be when I tell the dean or the department head of sociology that she's not who she says she is, which is just wrong of me to do it. But no, I mean, I didn't actually say that. But so here, right, you might say, like Brandon did, I'm looking at this research on public service motivation, and it's too focused on individuals, and it's not focused on sort of a sense of community. And that's in fact the title sheet, of the concept she's dealing with. She took ideas from public service motivation literature in public administration, and took some ideas from the community development literature about how you might build a community and synthesize them into something that should provide lessons for both sets of scholars. Right? That's hard. Any of these things are hard to do because you're basically trying to get experts in the field to think differently about what they've been doing all along. Right? Now, as reviewers, as co-editors, or as editors, we try to find people from different that will look at the manuscript from different angles, and hopefully will be open-minded to it. However, that's easier said than done sometimes. So if you're looking for, I mean, I don't know if this helps you, but these are the kinds, and these aren't easy to do. And I'm not saying that everything in JPAR satisfies these conditions very well. I'm saying that we feel like it's doing enough of that can add value.
But it does seem to be that last point, like where yours would link in, is that you could make this contribution, that tying it into, like you said, maybe network theory, but then, and I mean, I think, like Brad's saying, it's hard to do, but just remember, like, only less than 1 in 10 attempts actually end up in the journal anyway, so it's, and I think the other thing that is, I would suggest is, don't take this and say, well, it's going to be too hard and it's going to be not worth the effort. If you make an attempt and you put it in and you go through the review process, that will be really helpful information you get, even if it's ultimately not published. You'll get that feedback from people who've been thinking about it certain ways, who may tell you what they think are the limitations or strengths or holes, let's say, in maybe the way you're trying to connect. So I would say don't be discouraged from attempting. This may, even if Brad says it's hard, because going through that review process, you could get really valuable information that might help you make it a stronger contribution, more likely to get published the next time you spend.
In fact, the first piece I published in JPAR, the most heavily cited thing I've ever done, does this and this. Because when I wrote it, I was tired of reading articles in public administration review and stuff that were talking about Maslow is the answer to motivation. And I wrote a piece saying Maslow is not the answer to almost anything, though it's a fun thing to talk about. That we should be thinking about more of these social cognitive theories of motivation. And my first view of it, my first draft of that article basically said, anyone who talks about motivation and cites and says Maslow is the answer, or even Herzberg is the answer, doesn't know what they're talking about. They're wrong, and here's why. Now, that didn't get accepted, surprisingly. What I had to do is look then at, here's some things that people liked about Maslow. Here are some things of this more recent literature on motivation, and try to say how these two theories can be helpful for each other, because people don't really, no reviewer, because it's only being sent out to people who probably published talking about Maslow, is going to like what I say, unless I'm not as arrogant in the way I say it, where there are some lessons involved. And that's something that took me a long time to do. So these are not mutually exclusive strategies, and they're not easy. But at the end of the day,
If you study public management today in Brazil, we have a huge problem of resistance. I just finished a huge project in the Secretary of Education, and they said, well, we'd rather die than cooperate with the governor and the Secretary of Education. And we're about to have this huge strike. Teachers are planning a huge strike for now. And when you view them, you see very much the issue of legitimacy and how tense political issues between public administration. And you invite them to cooperate with you, and they say, well, we'll cooperate to kill you, but not to align. And this is very much the sort of issues we see now, and it hardly fit in any methodological individualistic approach, because it's very much political issue inside and public administration.
yeah, and not every country is going to be as fortunate as the U.S. to have two political parties that get along and work together so well to develop policy. That was sarcasm. But that's true. Even when I worked in agencies, when I worked in an agency in New York, we were supposed to do our construction through the construction fund, but we'd find a way to do it through the dormitory authority, because we didn't like the way the construction fund operated. But we sort of had to cheat to do it. And we thought that we were doing the right thing, but maybe we were, maybe we weren't. So it is a difficult thing to try to get a group of people who think one way to be more open-minded about what you want, what you're saying. And journal editors and reviewers are people that you need to figure out a way of strategies to help them see the value in your work and be more open-minded to it.
But I think the topic of legitimacy of the state is sort of core public administration question that should be in the realm of what's considered for the journal. But you have to pitch that or frame that in a theory that's recognizable to reviewers. And so maybe it's a theory from political science about governmental legitimacy that you say, look, this is something that's very relevant to administration in many parts of the world that's being missed in our current theoretical understanding of how co-production occurs. And so we're taking the co-production literature and this theoretical framework about legitimacy and pulling them together in sort of the way that Brad describes.
And again, I mean, a lot of my own research, I've not even submitted to JPAR because it didn't feel like it fit this. Well, I can't submit to JPAR anymore. When I was the editor, because it didn't feel like it fit. It was important research, but it didn't fit these. It didn't satisfy these criteria, or to the extent that I could make it, it would have been way too much work for me. the other stuff I wanted to do. Right? So again, there's always going to be some trade-offs. Okay, I just want to add, we can continue that kind of conversation, but I only have one more slide. Some concerns about the future of publishing in this field and everything else. Those of you who might be familiar with the comic XKC Geek may have seen this before. But in the last few years, there's been an increasing concern about the reproducibility of research and the crisis in confidence in research. This isn't just about the idea of plagiarism or inventing data. So this is the 9 circles of scientific hell, according to XKCD. And you see this limbo, which all of us are in at some point. We oversell, where we have a small idea, we have a contribution, but we try to make it as something that we just solve cancer, but it's much smaller. We do post hoc storytelling, where we run a bunch of numbers, we find a number that we like, and we figure out to tell a story around that, right? Which in some fields, like with qualitative research, some people, there's approaches to that that might be legitimate, better the approach that you take. We have p-value fitting, so we saw that study by Bem, a very famous social psychologist, who did this big study to show that that extrasensory perception exists, right? And he had a sample size of over 2,000. He did this big article, it was 100 pages long, with like a 100-page attachment. And it's not been able to be replicated. And they feel like what he did was just collected more and more data. He'd collect data on 100 people. He'd run the numbers. They weren't what they liked. He collected data on another 100 people. Ran the numbers, see what they looked like. If he didn't like it, he kept collecting data. That's their theory, one of their theories about this, right? There's the plagiarism. There's a number of different aspects of this, but ultimately there's a concern these days that the research that we're publishing is not always going to be reproduced. I don't know if you're familiar with that study that looked at whether or not you do the Superman pose in the morning, and that's going to make you more strong and more confident throughout the day. It's a nice piece in the U.S. that got published, and then the studies that have tried to replicate it have not been able to. But when it's not replicated, when you don't replicate it, you have a null result. A null result's a weak result because you don't know whether it's because of your study design or your study or your sample size, your statistical power. There's all kinds of things, right? And what then happens is, we have these studies that find random chance. The 1 out of 20 that might find it by chance gets published, and the other 19 that doesn't find it can't get published. So that finding and that theoretical insight is not true stays forever, right? And some people argue that Herzberg's work was that way, or at least some people are famous for. So there's increasing concern in psychology and political science and others about the reproducibility project and about standards for publication. And they even identified a number of what might be considered acceptable research practices. Like you run your numbers, and you have a theory, and then you get your data, you run your numbers, and then later on you decide, well, you know what? I wonder if this is moderated by gender. And you put gender in there, and all of a sudden, poof, you get a significant result. Now that could be because gender is important, or it could be because that's chance, right? If you ran 20 moderators, one of them is likely to be significant by chance alone over simplification. So there's a whole series of what might be considered standard and acceptable research projects or research practices that end up creating make things much more likely to find false positives. There was this a paper. Here's a list of these practices that was done. A survey was done asking people whether they've done them, whether they've seen other people do them, and then they have a prediction of the amount of which they actually see is occurring. As I should have cited the article I stole this from, so I'm already in hell for plagiarism. But we see a lot of the practice that we do end up creating a crisis of confidence in our field that isn't just like the political scientists at Cal Berkeley who just made up his data and published off of it. But and this is where you see political science journals are buying into was it DART? DART, which very strict guidelines that if you're going to publish in our journal, you should You need to provide us all the code you use for the analyses, and you have to also provide us their data, and then other people can now have access to your data. And then you have in psychology where they want an experimental registry, where you register your experiment ahead of time. You say exactly what you're going to publish, or what you're going to cite, or what you're going to study, exactly how you're going to measure it, exactly the sample size you're going to get, so that you can't later on claim, whoa, look at what I tested and found, if you started varying from that. And maybe you varied it 100 different ways and found one of them to be significant, and you tell the story about it. So this is a big issue that's occurring in the US and the UK with these journals. JPARP is still thinking about how we want to tackle this too, but I felt like talking about journals and talking about publications, I felt like I could no longer at least bring this up, or ignore bringing this up. So that's my last slide, I promise. So I don't know if there are any questions for us, or any comments, or any suggestions beyond those that you mentioned. I don't know if that answered some of the questions that people had about strategies you might take.
Nobody wants to have a broader question I have, not just for GFR, but in general, as a younger scholar, is who should be doing replication studies and where should they be published? Because all the top journals will not publish them.
I want, if I ever get the chance to run another journal, I'd want to run a journal that's on OB, so I actually know something about the manuscripts being submitted, sometimes better. And I'd want to do something on reputation. In fact, Ken, if he was here, he's had this idea on the JPAR website with Oxford to create an online, sort of like an online journal that would not only do replication studies, but would also put null finding studies on the internet. Now, it wouldn't be published in the journal officially, but it would be we allow put it up online to allow people to access that. Just that a lot of scholars in the U.S. are now loading their articles and their manuscripts on that. Dataverse? No, it's not the Dataverse. It's not the open side. There's another one. There's a couple things in the U.S. I should remember the name, where you can sort of store all the work you're doing online and people can have access to it.
There's also, so I think this is a really important question, and I think as Brad was saying, there's some challenges in moving forward that more seriously. Is one, there's a convention of what researchers should be required to make publicly available. So, I think especially in some of the work that some of you may do and that some of us have done is, I've at times worked with data that comes from, let's say, government, but under very strict requirements for protection of those data, right? And so I couldn't turn around and give those data to someone else because I was given to them for a specific purpose, that purpose only, and then I may be obligated, like some of my data sharing agreements required me to destroy the data within X months of completion of the project. And so in that case, all I could do is give everybody the same information about the process by which I went to get the data. Although it's sort of, even that's sort of not really fair because I realized likely that would have opportunity to have that happen. So I think there are some problems we have to determine, we don't want to necessarily, and so some journals have taken this more extreme position, will exclude those kinds of that research from potential publication because I would not be able to provide it. There are websites like the University of Michigan consortium on ICPSR. I can't remember what it is. Sort of social policy research, where you can make your data available and you follow process, you submit it, and you can actually go there as well to get other data sets if you wanted to replicate something. But I think until we can have more of a consensus, and I think like in journal applications studies is very interesting. That's probably pretty different. But it's an evolving thing. Right. Keep paying attention to it. But you're right. There is that bias right now. I think it's because of the more recent attention to it. And so the studies that we found that people have actually done worse things, right? Like made up data or mispresented findings. I think there's going to be increasing acceptance to seeing the value of replication studies. studies, but again, those might be more selective, like they're overturning, like the autism study, right, that where, they found out the research in the UK had falsified his findings on the link between vaccinations and autism. And that particular study had been majorly influential on individuals' behavior, and then now literally put some communities at risk because people refusing to be vaccinated for fear of something that triple do. So that's, I think, big, taking on big things like that, you can, probably get replication published very high profile journal. We're a long ways from having made the norm that we would value replication.
Right.
So I was just talking with co-authors last night about the possibility of replicating another paper. But the implication of your question is that it's costly to replicate and the rewards might be relatively low.
Right.
And for us, in this case, we already have a data set that's better than the paper that was published. We see problems with how they thought about the paper. And it's cheap for us to replicate in this case, and we'll probably approach the editors and say, are you interested in essentially a response to the original paper that I think will probably show that they were incorrect with the original paper. So if the editor says yes, then we'll take the time to do it, but we want some payoff to doing that because, as Brad said, the market for replication is not as strong as it should be to correct the problems in the field.
Well, there's two ways. It looks like you're going to, your replication is going to challenge the previous stuff.
We haven't done it yet, but I suspect you're wrong.
And that's different than a replication because you can then challenge like a previous. But if you do a replication that says, you've done this, you've tested this in the United States or in the UK, and I want to see whether it's still true in Philippines, right? There are still going to be journals that will publish them. By you making the argument, I'm seeing whether this theory and whether this finding is reproducible in another setting at a different time, right? They won't necessarily be the highest ranked journals. But you can still make this argument that this is important. It wouldn't be important enough necessarily with JPART because if you reproduce it, it's not adding a new insight. What you're saying is, you know what, this last insight, we should even have more confidence in this last insight than what we did before. So that does create a problem. And I suspect that, especially for new scholars, in a lot of cases, your PhD advisors are probably telling you it's risky, but I think you should try to do something new and exciting. Come up with a new insight, because that's what will get you, will get you where you need to go a lot better than rather just the replication. But replication is important. I hope, like Carolyn, that this confidence in crisis and research and OB research, and even in medical science, there's a guy, Ianos from Greece, who's been talking about this in the high percentage of medical studies that are being done that are also not true. Where it finds a finding that's a false finding. And he was one of the first people to be talking about this, and he was focusing on medical science. It's now getting into the social sciences because of the Walana scandal, the Caltech scandal, the BEM finding. So hopefully it will blow back a little bit the other direction.
I also, as Don mentioned this morning, I was the editor of the Journal of Public Administration Research Theory from 2004 to 2008, and then president of the Public Management Research Association before Don became president. And I'm also currently president-elect of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. And as Brad was kind of alluding to, that association it's a bigger association than Public Management Research Association. The M is maybe a little bit smaller in there, so the management component is a little bit more policy analysis emphasis. But for example, those of you who were talking about, do you do work in program evaluation and others, right? So there's another outlet, U.S. outlet. It's usually, I think it's usually JPART and JPAM in the rankings. They're close. A couple times it's switched. Actually, JPART was, it came number one, I think, sometime, I don't know, it was around 2005, 2006, and then there's some like little jockeying position there before it became more steadily dominant, number one. So, but they're both really good journals, and The difference being, as Brad described this morning, is that the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory is more solely focused on the public management aspects, and Journal of Policy Analysis and Management has policy analysis first. It's more focused on policy analysis, but also has important component management. We also have a conference every year. That conference is in November this year in Washington, D.C. So I think part of Brad and Don's message this morning was that we really are interested in more opportunities for interchange with our presenting colleagues. And as you'll see, I have spent a lot of time in Brazil, and it's very easy to get me to come to Brazil because it's of all the places I've traveled in the world, it's my favorite place to come to. I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the research I've been doing here. So one of the things I did in preparation for today, we've been talking about a lot of these themes indirectly, but I looked in the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory over the kind of past 5 years. What I did was pulled out what are some of the most common themes that we're seeing. So basically where you see papers talking about these issues, or keep coming back to them in various issues. So like we were talking about earlier today, the conversations that are happening around particularly important themes. And my idea here was to not stand up here and talk about each of these themes, but to maybe talk a little bit from my experience, pick a few out, and talk about where I see lots of opportunities for kind of cross-national interest. And so as Brad was saying, talking about this morning, that it's less interesting to journals, I think, beyond just the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory or JPARC, just say, oh, well, we're doing this is interesting because it's in Brazil or it's in the Philippines, or even if it's in the US, but where we can speak to what is kind of a core problem or challenge we have, and we deal with it in various ways. We learn different strategies because we face different contexts. And so one of the things so I'll just pick a couple themes. Decentralization or devolution of responsibility for core government functions. I think Brazil is a pretty fascinating context for studying this because you had this change. I can't remember exactly when it happened. Was it the 1980s or where you pushed a lot of responsibility down to the municipal level, right? So there's resources that come from the federal government directly to municipalities. Because you have like 5,600 and some odd municipalities, you have opportunity for incredible variation in policy implementation. And you've got policy contests. And Brazil is also, in some sense, like if we pick out a Nordic country like the Netherlands or Denmark, they're very homogeneous, small countries. And so I think when you do things with administrative data in Denmark, one of the things that's why Denmark probably gets published a lot is they do get lots of data and they use them. But it's a very narrow context. Where in Brazil, like the US, you've got very different. You've got the Northeast, which is very different than other parts of Brazil. And so you have this rich variation in context for which you might expect, when the federal government or central government devolves responsibilities down, that you'll have lots of variation in how they get implemented or executed. So that's like one place where I think there's an opportunity for a lot more research. And I'll talk about the area that I focused on research that relates to in Brazil and other places. But so I see that as one, potential. And you guys can chime in. Contracting and contract management, I think it's another area where it's really important across contexts, but done very differently. So I don't know how much have performance-based contracts been attempted here in the public sector, and how well do they work given your differing kind of views on whether there should be competition for awarded of projects or and the other thing we were talking about earlier, like civil service reforms or public values and public service motivation. So some of the things, experimentation we know around the world kind of connected to some larger movements, larger public management reforms, and the idea that new ways of rewarding employees in the public sector, right? So I think we were talking earlier, I think we were talking last night, that the typical major, benefit for people in the public sector is you've got a stable job, you've got a nice pension, and you've got, relatively decent pay compared to the private sector, but over time, we know that in terms of reforms, that they may not be sustainable, right, for reasons of budget and economy and efficiency that Fabio mentioned earlier, efficiency being such an important concern. So as more pressure comes on, for example, through the introduction of public-private partnerships or things, that the pressure comes on the public sector to perform better. And so, I don't know in Brazil, to what extent are you trying, for example, potentially different ways of paying employees? We've experimented with that in the US, where it used to be the case that your salary is primarily determined by how long you've been in a certain position, right? You got pay increases over the years. Now they're experimenting with pay bands, like so for a given position, there could be variation in the pay for a given public sector worker depending on their performance. But then of course that makes us have to develop new systems with incentives, and so those are areas where even if you're not here now, you could theorize about would that work in Brazil, and what is the need for it in Brazil. We were talking with someone earlier about this issue of race and representative bureaucracy. So you have that situation too here in Brazil. We've got a variety of different races, and I was talking with someone else earlier too about the fact that sometimes in policy implementation, even if we don't think it's necessarily systematic, there can be discrimination. It can be racial, it can be gender. And so I think that's another really fruitful area as we've gotten to this. Experiments have come, a lot of experiments have been done in the US, kind of looking at, to what extent those inherent biases of discrimination are in there. We talked a lot about, we've been talking in casual conversations about our shared perspective that we're lacking good leadership in our society. In the U.S., we have a crisis in that right now. You have some crises going on here in Brazil too. So there's some interesting new work on transformational leadership. So these are all, I think, themes which my understanding of the Brazil context is that there can be important contributions. We're working on them specifically. This isn't the only slide, so the next slide has some continuation. Stop, or we can come back to this. Kind of formal and informal accountability in organizations. We study organizational behavior, right? We understand there are sometimes social norms that kind of govern what we do, as well as kind of the formal ones that are built into hierarchical systems of accountability, regulation. Don and I have, and I think you have too, right, Brad, done a little bit on red tape and organizational rules. Administrative burden that Don was talking about. I'm going to just give you an example now, but administrative burden is, I think your definition was it makes, it's basically, it makes it onerous for you to try to, for example, get services that the government might be supposed to be provided to, or public benefits or something like that. And so there's lots of ways in which it operates, and it is another one of those things that can contribute to inefficiencies to the government, both in how we deliver services and how effective it is, and also there can be cost to that for individuals. This is another big one. How much is really going on in Brazil in terms of performance measurement?
There are, I think, a lot, because there are being huge public sector reform. But all the instruments that you're pointing out, they are being adopted at the federal, state level, and municipal level. So it depends. You have differences from one state to another, but
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so that's a question: is can you study that, right? Those differences, because I think that's where a lot of our work, we get the leverage for understanding. How do you understand whether, performance, establishing, let's say, whether it's contract-based performance measurement, or putting it into your compensation, incentives to your compensation, or having systems of accountability which hold you accountable, like in education, we were talking about education earlier, and that's a big issue for us. So we all look at test scores, right? That's one important measure of accountability, but we know it's also an imperfect one. And so, I don't know, so I think these are kind of really important areas that are going to continue to be important in public administration, right? And part of it is because we have better data now than we used to, and so I don't know to what extent people have looked across state here, or across municipality on these kinds of things, or necessarily.
Not that.
So I'm suggesting those are interesting levers for research. The other thing that, again, Don's done a lot of work on this performance dialogue. I also just picked up this term from, I was in Brussels, and September, and I'm meeting with people from various countries in the EU. This is the EU's kind of new term, bench learning, where they're talking about, and we've sort of been doing this informally, right? Where you get information on your performance. So you can imagine, let's just do an exercise here. We say that, let's say we're trying to improve the education sector in Brazil, and we set performance standards, and then we look at it by municipality, right? How school systems are achieving certain measures. And then you see big differences, let's say, in the attainment of those goals, performance goals. Well, bench learning would say, we would set benchmarks by which we would say, like we were talking about that earlier, like a minimum standard that you should meet. So when you see some places, don't meet it, or some really exceed that benchmark, then you try to understand why, right? And that's where the mutual learning comes in. So it's a different way of thinking about performance in the sense of, well, if you don't hit those minimum standards, we're going to, like we do in the US, we're going to close your school. Or we're going to reorganize the administration of that school. It says, okay, you're not making that, but can we understand from talking to others who are doing better in similar contexts, and then use that for mutual learning and benchmarking to try and push more people above that benchmark. So, I think that's another potentially interesting area for work here in Brazil. I know this is a big issue for you right now too, trust in government, right? Trust in people, or people feeling like they even have citizen trust in their roles in the public sector. A lot of work's been done, I think, especially in Europe, on like citizen participation and satisfaction. I think there's a lot of interesting questions now about what those measures really tell us. So I think one of the arguments in people in Europe is like, well, if they're happy, that's all that matters, right? Well, not really. Like Fabio said earlier, we want people to be happy, but there are questions of efficiency, right? And could we be spending less to have people be equally happy? That comes from more on more. So I just basically picked out a number, so from going through the journal, these are a lot of areas where people haven't, this is where the research is, people are talking to each other about these issues in the journal. Before I move on, anybody have anything like, oh yeah, that really hits it for Brazil, or that's my idea, is it, or what do you think? Are these things that you think do naturally work here in your context, or is there data that you have that can facilitate this kind of work? Yeah? Well, we were talking earlier, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm dealing with experimental data on this project, but I'm basically taking research that came from the US and trying to prove that it's not quite the same that is happening here in Brazil in the area of representative bureaucracy. But on the other areas, maybe someone who's dealing with leadership or another aspect.
I actually think like you were saying, so I think one of your advantages you could do in Brazil, so in the US we have a federal government, then we have state governments, and then we have local governments, and we don't have as many shared governance or shared data systems at the local level, right? So localities might collect information very differently locally. I mean, the federal government can require, for example, local educational agencies to report certain information to the states, which then report to the federal government. But I think you have here, what I've seen in your systems, you do have some direct reporting of data, consistent data to the federal government from municipalities. So then you can have, 5,600 and was it 61 or so, I don't remember the exact number, municipalities reporting similar data, and that's the data that you can use to look at that variation in municipality about outcomes and implementation, things like that. So for us, it's a lot harder to do in the US to get that kind of data that allows us to look at local variation. We have some surveys that have collected it, like the survey that ICMA, County Management Association. So we have some things that are collected county-wise, but we don't, but it's a different, the county is also a different kind of bureaucracy than your local government, so same. So I'll move on from there, because we can come back and talk about these issues later. So what I want to do is give you one example from my own work, where I think this just shows how kind of cross-nationally, how we've taken an area of research, and it's kind of interesting because Brazil was like one of the ground zero places where this started. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with conditional cash transfer programs because Brazil has like one of the biggest conditional cash transfer programs in the world. And so, for those of you who may not be familiar, my U.S. colleagues, I'm sure you are familiar. But basic idea is that we transfer cash to the poor households. So it's usually needs tested. We try to make sure they're poor. And then, but there's also this idea that you're going to have these intergenerational impacts, right? So that we know that if you give cash to a poor household, there should be some immediate impacts in terms of like consumption, right? They can purchase more food, or they can spend money on school supplies. So there's going to be some immediate impacts. But the whole idea of actually attaching conditions, right, is that you're going to change the way people would typically otherwise run their household, right? So you're going to give them money to cover, let's say, the school fees, and then the kids stay in school, and you also have conditions, right? You check to make sure the children are maintaining certain, families have their kids going to school at certain attendance rates. I'm not sure if the Bolsa Familia conditions have stayed the same as when I looked at a while ago, but so there's for mothers, prenatal care, well-baby things. So all intended that the next generation would actually be more capable, right? So you're investing in human capital. They will have a better start, they'll have better nutrition, they'll be healthier, they'll be more productive for that. And then the next generation is not supposed to need the cash transfers, right? So I remember years ago when I was working with the Brazilian government, one of the things so I worked, to see a little background, so I worked before Bolsa Familia, I worked with Bolsa Escola, Bolsa Alimentación, Bolsa Petty, child labor program, and there were a variety of other programs that were being used. And the idea was that, so I still remember the person in the Ministry of Education, we were talking to in Cardoso's administration, when we were talking about Bolsa Escola, I said, well, if the program works, no one should be on it in like so many years out, right? We should help, families should be in a better place. And there was also concern about how often you should check, right, to make sure people are still eligible. Right. Well, if you don't ever check, and so Brazil was actually further along than a lot of other Central Latin American countries that were trying, because you were going to be more rigorous. I remember there was a cadastro único. Is cadastro still used? And I don't know if people have to come register every year, or did they back off on that commitment? Was it still have to? Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that goes with managing these are these administrative burdens, right? So someone has to check the conditionalities. Someone has to do the reporting. Someone has to check to make sure people are still are needing the benefit. And so, and as we know, or as we've learned in this research, is that those administrative burdens can sometimes be imposed differentially on different groups by people at different levels, right? So there might be federal rules or national rules or expectations on how the program will be implemented, but in 5,600 some municipalities, people might tie their own additional kind of requirements or conditions, or informally say, imply that you should vote for me if you get. So one of my grad students actually did some research using data from Bolsa Familia to see if in municipalities where the increase after the programs first come in, the rate of increase in participation was higher if those elected local leaders were more likely to get elected in the next election, right? So if they got more people receiving Bolsa Familia, were they more likely to be elected? Okay? So then we wouldn't expect something like political influence to tie into implementation, but it potentially could, right? So some of the other themes we've been talking about, right? So there's this devolution of administrative authority responsibilities to the local level, right? So you have to basically implement that. The locales are supposed to submit reports to the central government, Ministry of Social Development, on whether kids are compliant with attendance, and they're supposed to check that, and then reduce the bolsa if they're not compliant with conditions. Public-private partnerships in administration. So I think it's different today, but when it was first started, there were the Pastoral de Cancha. that were supposed to be kind of helping localities check to make sure people were really eligible or not, or should be getting, who was getting it, should be getting it, were there people who shouldn't be getting it? Issues of representative bureaucracy, are there, is there discrimination, how those conditions are applied, and then public finance and transparency, right? So a lot of people are concerned about the amount of resources also Familia takes. And it's not just what you pay out in the benefits, it's the whole administration of the program. So these are just some basic themes here. And what's interesting is that this map only shows, I'm only comparing 97 to 2008, I'm not comparing what it is today, so 8 years later. But back in 1997, it was basically Mexico and Brazil that had conditional cash transfer programs. It wasn't Bolsa Familia then. Like I said, there were a lot of other conditional cash transfer programs that were being used. Basically, your first kind of influence was to have them go all over, Central and South America. So, and I can name off a bunch of acronyms, right? But there were a lot of other Central South American countries which similarly adopted conditional cash transfer programs. And you can see that that's in the green here. So in 2008, you don't see much here in Africa or Asia. But if we look today at 2016, most of the bottom was Sub-Saharan Africa that we put up. Because basically what we've been doing is taking this, so there's one of my colleagues at UNC runs this project he calls the Transfer Project. And so the Transfer Project is about cash transfers, right? So I guess you're kind of ground zero here in Brazil, the original origins of this. But we went to Sub-Saharan Africa, there were a lot of things that didn't necessarily work the same way. Right? So you couldn't take Brazil's model and plop it into some of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa just the way it was. So I was talking with someone at lunch about this, so what are some of the things that we learned? So one of the innovations in both Mexico and Brazil was that, so who in the household is targeted to receive the Bolsa? Who?
Mostly the women.
Women. So if there's a male and female head of household, it goes to the females, right? So one of the problems with trying to do that in Sub-Saharan Africa is that AIDS so decimated the parents, and so we can't say it should go to female or male. We have to say a caregiver. So it might go to an aunt, or it might go to a grandmother, because the AIDS is really, in terms of that middle generation, there are a lot more orphaned children in Africa. So that was one thing. But the other problem is one of the things I learned back in like 2001 when I started working here on this in Brazil, is that Brazil actually had quite sophisticated infrastructure, even compared to the U.S. Because we have our own conditional cash transfer programs, called temporary assistance for needy families. And there were some things at the time that I was taking from Brazil and going back and saying, like, why haven't we done this yet? I mean, you were first to get the electronic cards that people could take, and there was even some challenges in doing that because obviously it's a lot harder to find places to use a card or go to a bank in the Northeast, right? And some of the Amazons and areas like that. So Brazil was really far ahead of a lot of its peers on that technology. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, we completely lacked that kind of infrastructure. So what they had to do then is, so where you can have people, get something deposited to account in a bank, we had to develop mobile pay points, right? So basically, we have there's a private contractor there that takes trucks, basically, which are like mobile banks, and then they have to drive them to these areas and these communities, and then basically set up temporary bank points. And then recipients have to know like the date that they can be paid, and they have to communicate that, and they go to the mobile pay point to get paid. So just different kinds of things like that in implementation, because we didn't have the infrastructure, they don't have the national federal infrastructure that you do in Brazil. But all this has been very interesting. So the minister of, one of the first times, like back in 2007, when I was at a conference or workshop in South Africa, where we had UNICEF and the World Bank and other funders there, we had the person I've been working with in Brazil from the Ministry of Social Development, who kind of set up your monitoring evaluation systems. He was there at that workshop too, trying to inform, how could we possibly do this because of the fact that Brazil was far ahead of others. So what I'm saying here is that, this is one example where you've actually been a leader in this kind of work, but I haven't seen much in the public administration literature at all on Brazil's contributions to what's happening around the world. Yeah.
Just a question, I think that it's really interesting, but it describes, does not exactly explain. How can we link all those descriptions to some kind of theory or some kind of...
Yeah, so I mean, I can show you, I'm going to show you a piece of research that I've done with the South African data, but you know, so one thing would be is if you would explain variation in effects, right? Of Bolsa Familia across,
It looks to me that as I see the transmission of these experiences from one continent to another, that the public sector capacity of Brazil is a strong indicator in terms of efficiency of the program. Because I mean, as you say, you've been working with the public sector here, and you know that there are good technicians, good bureaucrats, they work with good data, they have a lot of information systems that they got the system as a whole. And probably this would not be the case of the African countries that you've been working on it. So I think there is a place for generalization if you think about the public sector role in this and the strength. And I think this is a good
So one question you could do, which would be a kind of explanatory question, is what exactly is it about it? So what did Brazil do? Yeah, so I mean, so here's an idea. Like, could we figure out what is a cost, administrative cost per transfer, right? In Brazil, for each Bolsa, if you figured out administrative costs, right? And for the many transfers that you do, what would be the per transfer, what you spend on administration? What is the composition of that, right? So there is federal and there's municipal costs that have to come in and you know, so maybe it's, so I think there's a lot of questions that haven't been addressed that are explanatory questions. So like we were just talking, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have to use, you know, we have to partner with the private sector and use mobile pay points. You have a banking system. You had Caixa, your national bank, which was centrally involved in making all the payments. It's another way that you could have
And
efficiencies.
also banking correspondence, because you have as surrogates of cashing transfers.
So there's probably all kinds of interesting questions you could do. For example, one of the things we're really concerned about there is leakage. So when you involve the private sector, they can in turn charge fees to people because you have to pick it up at that. So the vendors of the pay point services can levy fees on people when they go to pay up, which reduces what the poor households get, right? Maybe yours is less here. So I think there are lots of potential explanatory questions. What explains impacts or better efficiency?
I think I would like to widen the perspective.
Yeah.
Because that's fine, but I think we can address the topics in more, let's say, passive approach, while keeping the emphasis on administrative aspects. I think we should also open it to see other things. For example, I supervised a PhD thesis comparing Brazilian and Argentinian program. But we, instead of looking at the administrative structure or functions or whatever, we decided to look at how the program works from the perspective of the families, of the women, and the workers.
Yeah.
And we went to field work with a very open mind, qualitative, and having as theoretical perspective more a philosophical attitude than a set of strict theoretical approach like the one the authors you mentioned in the morning would recommend. And I think this is the kind of issue that instead of looking for theory that will establish the standards of comparison, we go with a more open and wide perspective. I think we can reach the field much more.
Yeah, and actually, I should just say that, I mean, I'm speaking of this in part from the context that Brad set up earlier, so I completely understand your point there. And I'm trying to suggest themes within the public administration, but I'm also a professor of economics and education. Yeah, but I mean, I guess what I was saying is that I also think that there are many different ways that you wouldn't have to frame it only this way, and many different ways you could. So there's, I mean, even like if you think, for example, one of the things I've heard, you also have the advantage, you do have a data set that was collected, right? There was a baseline done before Bolsa Familia, and there was a follow-up survey. I don't know how many people are using those data that were evaluation that was paid for, I'm sure, in part by Brazil and some of the NGOs. But, so there are other interesting things, like you mentioned labor. I know one concern is about whether or not there have been disincentives because of the cash transfers for work, or you were kind of alluding, we talked about this earlier, like intra-household decisions, or how it affects intra-household relationships, and there's a whole other set of outcomes. So I think, yeah, I was just picking on this for one particular side. You'll see I'm going to give it a specific research here, but I think your point is very well taken, and that you don't have to have a narrow, can I get this published in JCART lens to address many of these questions. So just to give you an example of, so this is, and we relate this to a paper I just published in Journal of Public Administration and Research Theory, but one of the things I took on looking at cash transfer programs. So in this particular case, I'm working with data from the South Africa's, they have what they call a child support grant program, which is essentially a cash transfer program, although it has what we call soft conditions, not hard conditions, like in Brazil. But basically, we have found administrative burdens and cash transfer programs all over the world. We have them in the U.S., we have them everywhere. So what are those things? Document requirements, right? So if it's a means-tested cash transfer program, you have to bring some kind of proof of income. Now I know people here have to fill out a form. I don't know if they do actual checking with people's documents to prove how many rides a month that the family has. But this can sometimes be a burden, right, for some people, especially like in some areas where they're more rural. In a lot of places, this has especially been a case in Africa, they require people to go to social welfare offices to apply. And so really long lines, limited service or inconsistent service hours, lots of language and communication barriers, so some of the more indigenous languages where if you don't have people at the office to be able to speak to you, delays in processing, lack of clarity or knowledge about program rules or how to apply or reapply. And then one of the things we found is that, again, this thinking about the transfer of pushing down responsibility to local levels is that can also allow for procedural or administrative discretion in those burdens. So in the context, the specific example I'm going to talk about South Africa, most of you are probably familiar, there was an apartheid regime right before that was broken apart in the 1990s. And it had very specific classifications of people by race, and people had documents, and those documents, depending on your race, could make you very highly discriminated against in terms of where you can live and who you can interact with and what kind of expectations you can have for service in your government. But those were all supposed to have ended, right? Apartheid was supposed to have been completely abandoned. In fact, there's the South African Constitution, which was developed after the apartheid regime was dismantled, is extremely protected. It's one of the, in terms of the world, in terms of protecting human rights, it's one of the strongest constitutions in the world because of how carefully they were trying to protect that. But that doesn't change the fact that when people go to social welfare offices, the person behind the desk may still look at you as being of a certain class and still discriminate because of long-standing cultural beliefs or personal beliefs. And so that's one of the things that we've seen. And I don't know to what extent that plays out here, whether they make it harder or not for certain groups to get, or they think certain people or groups of people are necessary. But what's difficult about documenting that is that it can happen even within the same office, right? Not necessarily going to happen only by location. So these are just some of the ways in which the administrative burden has played out in cash transfer programs. This is actually my last slide. And so this is just, so this article, which is on advanced access in the Journal of Public Administration Research Theory. So I'm using, like I was saying, so this is an example where I'm actually using data from an impact evaluation that we did in South Africa. So I was working with a team of other researchers, some based in South Africa, some based in the UK, working with them to look at the impacts of cash transfers. So we worked with UNICEF, and if I put up this one diagram we had of all the potential impacts, I mean, we hit everything, right? Cash transfers are supposed to solve poverty and all its unintended ills, like improve people's health, child nutrition. We're measuring child anthropometrics, right? We've got impacts on labor, child labor, adult labor, vaccinations, you name it. So we collect a ton of data in this evaluation. One of the areas that I was looking at particularly was also in youth risky behavior. So in Africa, the reason we were looking at this is because in Africa, South Africa in particular, youth who engage in risky behaviors it's a kind of a life and death sometimes game that they're playing. So for women who are in their late teens, early 20s, the rate of HIV infection is 1 in 5. So 1 in 5 women in this room, around that age would be HIV infected. So, and that was also, poverty was a very important mechanism for that because one of the ways that young women dealt with that was to have older boyfriends who would give them money. So transactional sexual relations. So what was this research about? So I just was describing all the different administrative burdens, and so my question was to find out, so what we documented was that administrative burdens were reducing the amount of cash transfers that children were receiving over the course of their lifetime. So they might get disconnected, and the family has to go reapply, and that application process may or may not result in them ever getting connected again. So there were a lot of administrative problems. There were a lot of changes in the law in the age of eligibility over time that created confusion. There wasn't consistent delivery of information by the federal government on eligibility criteria or confusion about who kept it and for how long. So we were talking about earlier, right? So once you connect a family, you don't necessarily forever get the benefit, right? There's some checking of eligibility conditions. So all of that contributed to what we actually measured it that, so what I did was ended up measuring intended cash transfer receipt, which would be the total months they were legally eligible to be getting a cash transfer in the family for that child. Like I said, in South Africa, the cash transfer was given to the caregiver for that child. And then the actual receipt. So there was an intended amount, which we could actually get because we could look at whether the family was eligible at a given time and age eligible and things like that. And then how many months they actually received the transfer. So we had administrative data to do that. So what I did in this empirical work was to match youth. So on the intended cash transfer, so I look at 2 youth who were supposed to be getting cash transfer, let's say 150 months over their lifetime. That was the intended. Let's say one gets 150 and the other one gets 80 because they were disconnected at some point. So then my question is, to test this empirically, is do the adolescents with the same intended dose, do those interruptions to disconnections, those who were interrupted, disconnected, do they have smaller impacts from it? So this idea of, so it's moving from saying, well, what's the efficiency cost or the access cost of administrative burden to say, is there a cost in terms of individual impacts? So do the youth who receive less of the transfer have poorer outcomes than those who did? So what I was trying to do was push the literature in 2 ways. So I didn't talk about my framing. So one, I was trying to expand the theoretical framing of how we think of administrative burden and how it operates. And I was also trying to expand the literature and saying, because most of the literature talked about, well, reduces people's access to the benefits. But if you have a cynical view and say, well, it just costs us less public sector dollars, you might not care. Well, or if they really needed it, they would have tried harder to get access, right? So it turns out those who have those problems were actually more likely to be poorer, right? So more in need of the cash transfer. And then what I found is that, in fact, those interruptions or disconnections were significantly related in terms of diminished outcomes for youth. So those youth were more likely to be engaging in risky behaviors. and educational attainment was lower for the females who weren't, in a sense, fully protected, and they didn't get all the cash transfers they were supposed to. And then what I also did was looked at, so this is one of the good things about this, right? And this is what we were talking about earlier, is that there were real things government could do to change that, right? And so, in fact, the South African government had been doing some of those things, like trying to more actively outreach to communities. There are things that they could change about their requirements. You can improve the efficiency of your administration, right? There are ways you can, lots of levers you can get at to reduce administrative burdens. And so, this is the article, if you're interested, this is what kind of Brad was talking about earlier. I mean, I use data from South Africa specific context and a specific program evaluation, but the paper is not about, what was the effect in South Africa. The paper was about administrative burden. And this was a way to empirically look at why we should care about that, right? So my argument at the end, the bigger issue is in policy debates, we don't think about this, right? We say, oh, well, yeah, it sucks. It's hard to get access to the program. We may lose a few people here and there, like, oh, that just costs us less. It's not a big deal. But if we think that, for example, if there were, just assume there was some kind of administrative burden of Bolsa Familia, in the case that you weren't getting children the benefits as early as you could, right, there may in fact be some lifelong developmental effects for children, but we haven't really done any of this kind of measurement in literature, so it's where I was trying to push it. So that was just one example of kind of research where I think there's opportunities for a lot more cross-transfer. And I was wanting to say this because of the fact that Brazil's been kind of the leader in the development of this intervention, which is now continuing to spread all over the world. We're still learning about it. And you actually you've done one of the more rigorous impact evaluations, and I think those data have been very underutilized. Anybody who wants to collaborate in this or other areas related to education and stuff, but I'm very willing to collaborate. I can read Portuguese, I can speak it very well, so keep that in mind if you're interested in collaborating.
In terms of the special issues, for example, you set up like a table earlier on of the 7 or 8 topics that you think that they are very interesting topics. That I think it's I'm sorry that I wasn't here before because I had a meeting.
In these themes?
Yes,
These themes?
lunchtime. So you have, for example, and I know that maybe there are things beyond that. Right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So,
yeah.
but for example, do you set up like forums or venues for special issues in each one of these forums that people could get more instructed or more educated about how to deal or what are the main topics or how to, even further the discussion, even if we are not published, because as you said, only 8% of the papers are published, but there's a lot of discussion behind all of this, right? And we miss a lot of this discussion. So is there any venue or any forum that we could bring this discussion so that we can learn more and even learn how to do or how to approach, or if not to approach us, or find innovative ways of approaching?
Actually, Brazil, I mean, before you went to Bolsa Familia, in Brazil here there were organizations that hosted some international workshops that brought people together from other countries to talk, for example, about cash transfers. So Brazil was actually leading that kind of discussion early on before you went forward with Bolsa Familia and kind of integrated a bunch of other programs together. So, I mean, I think what hasn't happened that I see is I haven't seen the other end side of it, So some of there were several universities that were more involved in the actual work on the collecting the data and evaluating that. I've seen no follow-up from them internationally, like workshops and stuff like that.
Because what I was thinking is that basically, I think for cash trust is a big deal in Brazil and has been widely discussed. But for example, for other topics that have been, it's more kind of it's a spread and a widespread, and it's kind of there is not a for example, a group or a center that's can say, oh look, you can have all these discussions and there this and this and this, and then we will have a special issue on the first topic or the second one. There's a way to kind of give information or even the journal, the JPART, to have the initiative of.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Don mentioned earlier, where you could imagine this being something like this, remember Don mentioned that the Public Management Research Association conference, you can organize a pre-conference workshop where you bring people together So, like you said, okay, let's say we don't need to do that for cash transfer, so let's say there was something else in one of these themes, or it doesn't have to be one of these themes, I'm just picking this up, because I just pulled this from the journal. But if there was an area where you were doing a lot of, so let's say it's something related to motivating your civil servants to work towards greater efficiency in the bureaucracy, right? You could actually work with the leadership of the organization to say, we want to do one of these workshops, and then we get the call out to people around the world who are doing research around that theme. And like you said, it doesn't have to be published in those workshops.
Yes.
You can bring your formative work, you can bring your work in process, and even the conference, a lot of papers that people submit are works in progress. We don't want papers at the conference that have already been published. People can go read those. We want people reading their best work in progress, right? So these conference venues, and then for something special like that, you can do that. So beyond PMRA, I'm sure there are other places where that's done. But you can also, I think, if you were interested, for example, in organizing something here in Brazil, let's say you want a basin in Brazil and you want to bring other researchers there. That's another thing where you can contact those of us who are in PMRA. We're more than happy to work with you to get the word out, to bring people there, to give you, kind of share expertise for putting that together, given that, we've started to do that at the association. Not Don, if you want to add anything more on that.
Well, your question is partly about community building. So how do I find my peers in the world?
And how JPOT can help us to build up these communities and find or concentrate
I can talk about that last part in terms of actually a trend in publishing in PA journals in general. But if you want to talk about that first part.
Well, I think you go to conferences, you submit a paper. If you know enough people on the same topic, maybe you organize a panel and you submit a panel. But you submit a paper, it gets accepted. The other 3 or 4 people on that panel are presumably people working on the same topic. Then you go to the other panels that you think are relevant to you, and you start to learn, how do these people talk about the ideas that I'm interested in? Oh, they're using a different theory than I am, but they're talking about essentially the same thing. You sort of have to pick up that tacit knowledge by physically being there, observing how people are representing ideas, talking to them after the panel, having a drink with them at the reception, finding out what they're working on next. But those are community building exercises where I think physical presence is the most important predictor as to whether you can actually join or build that community.
Yeah, in Cardiff, the people at Cardiff, that's an example. So there was a group at Cardiff University years ago that was working on, I think there's around performance management stuff, and they held and they're actually out of the business school there too, so they also have that, but they convened a workshop and they brought people from around, and literally that seeded a lot of fruitful collaborations. There's still some people who will continue to work together in that network, and that's been 10 years since more than 10 years. It was like 2005, 2004, 2005 they first did that. So that's another way. So I think you're right. It's how do you, like you said, network communities, whatever, people who can share this. I think there's so much rich things going on here in Brazil. We don't want to see more.
And I think that the way to address this is through the conference, putting together these workshops, working with the conferences. What we find at the journal end is special issues kill journals. Publishers don't want us doing them anymore because they don't add to the impact factor, because no one ever cites them, because they're too poor quality, to be honest with you, mostly poor quality and too narrowly niched. And it is a business. So when Oxford comes, Oxford makes a lot of money off the fact that we have an impact factor. If our impact factor goes down, that impacts their profits, and then that changes their strategy of how to allowing us to do certain things, right? And it's not just JPAR. PAR does not do special issues anymore either, public administration review. And we at JPAR had tried a middle ground. Ken Meyer, who's the director of the journals for the Public Management Research Association, could once a year put together his own little symposium over a topic that he thought was very important. And then he would provide stronger leadership over there to try to manage the quality content. Another strategy we've done, and this is a project that you worked on
Yeah,
with
with
Richard Walker.
Yeah, well, we got money from a foundation, basically, he did in Hong Kong, and then the idea was to bring scholars working in a particular area together, and this was in Asia, right? So a lot of scholars in Asia are saying, we want to get our stuff in international journals where it's more visible, we want to start building these networks, but, so initially the idea was if the work was good enough, we might try to combine the articles into particular issues, but we didn't promise anything publication. The idea was to help them, so through Richard and I and other more senior people in the field we worked with the young scholars. We did sort of like a before you submit to the journal review process, where they submitted to us first, and then we gave them feedback of why you're not going to get into the journal with this version, and then it was up to them to take that feedback and then give it a shot at the journal. Yeah.
And we had about 12 or 13 submissions for that, and we had promised that if enough of them got accepted through the normal review process, the normal peer-reviewed double-blind process, which special issues are usually not part of, that we would package them together as a special issue. Only one got accepted through the normal process. So we published it, but we didn't publish it as a symposium. So another approach we're doing now is if we have someone who's really interested in a topic, like if Carolyn really wanted to do something on the administrative burden with Dawn, what they could do is they could take the articles that are already published in JPARC and create a virtual issue and have an introduction to that virtual issue about how these papers fit together. And we've been doing a lot of those, but papers are already published with some kind of editor introduction time together and helping people see the connections.
So you have to go through 5 years of the journal and pick out 6 different issues to see how they can come together.
Those have been successful. We're creating this after the fact approach, and people do download those. But those and it increases our downloads, increases the attention that those articles are given. The drawback is those are articles that have already been through the review process. So the trend is, in at least English written public administration journals, is to move away from those special issues because the publishers and others are strongly advising against, right? Now there are some exceptions. Steve Kelman over at International Public Management Journal will still do them on topics that he cares about. He has a lot more control over that journal because it's, like I do as an editor of an association journal, like JPARC. PMR, Public Management Review, also does these, and I hope that they continue to do it because I do think if all the journals doing it, it ended up creating these problems. But all the journals don't do it, then there's going to be stuff that we're not, important stuff that we're not getting out there. But Don and Mary Feeney put together a special workshop in Madison on red tape. And again, that was a wonderful opportunity to get a community of scholars together from different angles who are interested in the same thing, even if we called it a different name or even spoke from different theories or literatures, and brought that together with the mind of spurring on more conversation among scholars on this topic. And we also were going to do a symposium on that. We did at IPMJ, but even in that case, I think the conversation was more powerful than the actual special issue. Because in the special issue, I think only 40% of the manuscripts that got submitted to that got accepted. So again, there was a lot of quality control that Kelman asked for that probably weeded out more than what people felt comfortable about if they were seeing that as the outcome from this workshop. Where I think that workshop had a lot of very positive outcomes that weren't about the special issue. I'm not just saying this as Dan Don's right here. But
so, one thing I just want to say to close on this point is that if you have ideas like that, and you think like we think we could have a potential for a contributor to Rich Vena scholarship on this particular theme, this area, or whatever it is, you should feel free to get in touch with us. We're more than happy to be facilitators of these kinds of things, to give you, so that's why, that's why we're happy to be here today at this workshop that you organized. You already kind of taken these steps to put this together.
another option would be to have an outcome in terms of a book. So Jim Perry, for example, put together a couple public service motivation conferences. That the outcome was that certain individuals got involved in a book that eventually got published with the Cambridge or Oxford Press. That has gotten cited quite a bit, and those pieces individually may not have survived a review process at the journal, but they were especially valuable when you put them all together. And that book has gotten, like I said, a lot of visibility, but he wouldn't have been able to do that with a special issue.
I'd like to weigh on it just a quick note. I think there is an identity issue of public administration as a field that it's always going on when do a translation from US to Brazil. So what people understand are what things in public administration, what public administration is, and all that. This has always been an issue, public administration. So I don't think we'll have an answer for this issue today, but the diversity of the audience, I think, reflects our own supposition of what we suppose public administration needs. It reflects on leading things. But I do think there is a common ground there. And I say that the common ground is in the public sector. What's going on in the public sector. If we see empirically, we see what is being published outside Brazil and in Brazil, if there is a common ground, it's what's going on in the public sector. This is the mean. Because intellectually, I think we'll have an infinite debate. But
I think one of the positive things though is like I think it was Don actually was talking about this earlier, where public administration started. You know, some in the U.S. it's equally diverse. So some public administration programs are still in business administration programs affiliated there. Some have been kicked out of political science parts are kind of considered an orphan-like program, and then some are schools of themselves, and so we have some of that kind of those identity issues as well. But I actually think that those diverse origins, and as we've come to accept and bring them in, are actually really healthy, right? So things like contracting and contract management. I mean, I've drawn a ton out of the business literature, economics literature on issues where you're thinking about things about incentives or performance-based contracts or what are going to be those challenges. So I think it's healthy that we have this diversity of disciplinary origins and that not all programs or schools look the same or are composed of the same groups of people. Not everybody in all of our schools. I mean, we have some people in our schools who don't ever publish a paper, right? Like you were saying, that probably should never be a criteria because we are interdisciplinary and diverse and do work a lot of different things. So.
Thank you.
So I wanted to try and talk at the end about some very broad questions while talking specifically about how my experience as a researcher informs those questions. So three very basic questions is who we study, and I'm going to return to the literature on administrative burdens that Carolyn raised, how we study, I'll talk about my research on performance management and talk about changes in how that's been studied in the last 15 years or so, and how we communicate. So partly about how we communicate to one another as scholars, and how we communicate beyond the scholarly community to practitioners. So for that part, I'm also joined by Phil Kangas, who's a partner with Grant Thornton, which is one of the largest public sector consulting firms in the United States, and who is a stakeholder for the type of research I do. He's the type of person I want to be reading my research. So hopefully he'll say he's reading what I do, but he'll also tell us something about what he's looking for from the scholarly community if we do hope to be relevant. So this question of who we study, public management or public administration is a series of relationships. Partly it's a relationship between political officials and bureaucrats, partly it's relationships between bureaucrats and the public. What I argue is that if you look, at least in the US, or JPAR, the big public administration journals, the majority of the research there features the experience of bureaucrats, their motivations, their productivity. There's relatively little attention to the experience of citizens. So how do citizens interact with government? What are their experiences like? We rarely take their perspective in framing our research questions. So I think that's sort of a gap, very broadly within our field, that we should be doing a lot more of that rather than having, one more paper about the public service motivation of bureaucrats. The marginal value of that, I think, is low. The marginal value of taking, sorry, Brad, of taking the citizen perspective is very high. So Brad mentioned this red tape conference we had in Madison, I think in 2011. And one thing I took away from that conference is that I needed to move away from the field of red tape research, because the type of questions I wanted to ask were defined more or less as out of bounds in the empirical red tape research that had developed since 1993 in public administration. So I started to draw from other literatures, and I argued for this concept of administrative burden that Carolyn talked about. Partly because it gave me a way to talk about these issues of how citizens experience the state. So the one assumption here is that when citizens interact with the state is teaching them something about their standing as citizens, whether they have power and standing to claim benefits or not. Another very basic assumption is that how burdensome an interaction with the state is affects whether citizens can actually access public goods, whether public goods reach their targeted audience. And so this is the paper that we published in JPART with two co-authors. We defined administrative burdens in terms of 3 different types of costs. And in Carolyn's paper, I think you should read both papers. She expands on those definitions, so it's a really nice expansion on some of the initial ideas. But the first thing we said is there are some learning costs that arise when you encounter the state. So for example, let's say you're trying to get some sort of program or benefit. You have to know what that program is. You have to know if you're eligible or not. You probably want to have some estimate of what you might get out of that. You have to know how to apply. We're not born with this knowledge as human beings, so we have to acquire it, and that takes some time and effort. So there's a lot of examples of very large social programs where there have been surveys of people who are theoretically eligible but aren't taking up the programs, and they simply don't know that the programs exist, or they believe incorrectly that they're ineligible, or they think incorrectly that the benefit is so small that it's not worth their time to find. So these are learning costs. The second type of costs are compliance costs, and these are more like traditional red tape. So the costs of filling out forms, complying with administrative rules, bureaucratic requirements, discretionary requirements that street-level bureaucrats might impose upon you, filling out forms, providing documentation. Carolyn mentioned how frequently you have to recertify your status. There's a big difference in terms of whether people stay on program if you make them recertify their status every 12 months or every 6 months. The more you make people recertify their status, the more they tend to drop off programs. And also the money spent. You know, I'm an Irish person living in the United States. I had to get through the process of citizenship there. I spent a lot of money to get legal help and to pay for my applications. That required that I had that money and resources to satisfy requirements. The third type of cost, and the one that's most difficult for us to measure in practice, but I think clearly exists, is our psychological costs. So do you have a sense of stigma if you interact with the state and you're acquiring some sort of benefit that is unpopular among the general public? If your interactions feature a sense of loss of power or personal autonomy, if you're treated very poorly and you have no real capacity to respond to that, you simply have to accept how you're treated, there's some type of psychological cost to that. And in some cases, whether you get benefits or not, there's sort of a big effect on your family outcomes. You might worry very much about whether my citizenship request gets turned down, or whether my food benefits, I actually receive them or not, and my family can eat this food. So those were the types of costs that we thought. They're maybe not everything about administrative burdens, but there are 3 very big boxes that you could use to then try to start measuring administrative burdens. And when I was writing up these slides, I forgot the name of one of my co-authors, but I remember now. But that generates then a research agenda, because once you start to conceptualize, then you can start to move forward and say, now we can start to measure, now we can start to answer research questions. And that research agenda that we refer to in this paper asks us a series of really specific questions. So first of all, why do burdens exist? Why are burdens higher in some localities versus somewhere else? In some administrative offices versus other places? And in the United States, we have a nice way of addressing this question because we have many federal programs that are implemented by states, and states have discretion in how they implement them, so there's variation across states. So a very simple paper with Pam Hurd and Elizabeth Rigby, the invisible third co-author, looked at variation in compliance burdens across 50 states in Medicaid applications. We just took the applications and we did a content analysis and coded how hard or easy it was to fill out the forms. Very simple. And we found that it depended on the political party. The only real explanatory variable we could get to explain variation was which political party had unified control of the government. So in some states, there was a lot more burdens if you tended to have more conservative parties who are historically critical of public health programs, and in states where you had more liberal parties who tended to have easier or less burdensome requirements. Yes.
Scarce information, is it also a choice? I mean, the need to have more information regarding population?
Right. So that's a good question. So one of the issues we started to grapple with when we came up with this idea is value trade-offs, which is that one value might be, for example, access to a good or program. We want all of the eligible people to get access because then the program gets targeted to the people who are supposed to receive it, and we see the type of benefits that we hope that program will generate. But another perfectly valid public value is to minimize corruption or fraud or overclaiming. And so managing burdens, those are 2 values, access versus fraud, that occur again and again and again. On the one hand, the people who argue for access say let's have fewer burdens, and the people who argue for fraud say we need to have more protections. So I think one of the differences between how we've conceptualized the idea of burden and the red tape people is that if the red tape people have historically said if a rule has any sort of value at all, then it's not red tape. Right? So if it prevents any sort of fraud, it's not red tape. Whereas we would say there are some cases where burdens might improve your success on one value. Say you might minimize the 1% of people who are fraudulently claiming a benefit, but they really damage another value, like access. So suddenly you lose 20% of eligible claimants who no longer start taking up the program. And those are value trade-offs that in theory you could actually try to empirically measure. And in some cases you can sort of use your common sense to say whether an additional burden really helps to minimize the fraud one, for example. So my favorite example in looking at these Medicaid forms across the 50 states is that in New Mexico, if you're a beggar or a panhandler, that's the term they use in the form, you were supposed to document your income, right? So how does this work? Do you ask for receipts from people who give you money on the streets?
Alternatives, and that's done at a level of thinking maybe below academia, but certainly has real practical benefit to others. Those type of professionals exist across the ministries of government here, as well as in the 36 states, or I'm sorry, 26 states and in the district. So those type of professionals I know have conferences where they will be collaborating, and I think participating in those would be great access and insight for you as you're deciding how to spend your research time and develop your strategies. Also functionally, so that's a service, sort of service line, what I would describe, network. Also, there are communities like in security and defense, let's say, or in healthcare, or in housing. And there are other sort of narrowly focused sort of functional aspects that government provides. Again, those type of challenges exist in each of those states, and I think that you can really get us a lot of rich research there by looking at how those type of issues are addressed across that broad spectrum. So I think if there's any questions from me, I'm happy to answer them. But thanks for having me.
I would like just to say there is a challenge for Brazil because you're tending to close the academia from the practitioner world. It's happening in the States probably, it's the same. Having our own academic journals, having our own built community, just self-sufficient community. So this institution used to be the way much more like you described it than it is today. But there has been, this has been a trend. I mean, we have some people here that came from our professional programs. That are people that work for the public sector, but it's always an individual decision. So people that work for the public sector have a research or sensibility, sensibility, but it's not. I mean, this is a topic that I think worries me a little bit. If we tend to push those two words apart too much, but anyway, this is my answer.
I've actually worked in state government in 2 different states before I became an academic. And well, actually once after I finished my PhD, I worked in the state of New York afterwards for a while. When I read, when I was a manager in government, I didn't find almost anything in power worth reading. Sorry. Some of it was interesting, and I read it anyways, because I got the journal for 30-some years, even though I was a manager. But I didn't find a lot in there that was insightful. I found it interesting intellectually, just like I might find a piece of fiction interesting, or something from The Economist interesting. It didn't necessarily help me in my job, almost at all. So there is, even though JPART is really not targeting practitioner audience, there's part of me that says that's important to do, but this other is very important too. When I teach at the master's level or professional level, professional students are going to go into the profession, I almost never assign anything from JPART or PAR because it's not going to be something they're going to relate to. Or if I do, we spend a lot of time picking it apart so they can then go, wow, I see the confused. However, when I teach a PhD course, I have a really long list of articles from JPART, PAR, and other journals that I expect them to read. Because you need to know a lot about how things work to be able to explain and give advice to people who are actually going to do it. And one of the examples I used to give is, I don't know how many people have ever read a Tom Clancy novel, right? He would spend 30 or 40 pages describing how Russian nuclear submarines were built in order to tell us there's feasible that one guy can hide on that submarine. Now, as a reader, I don't need to know that, and I skip those pages. But as an author or as a scholar, I need to know 30 or 40 pages worth of information about how a Russian submarine works, so I can go into students and explain to them how the administrative burden can be hidden from view from one aspect or from a different aspect. So it is, that relevancy and the connection between the two is very difficult. And in my own brain, I struggle with it because I've been in both roles.
I think what Don is saying is something that is, it's actually a field of research that's growing. So one of the terms that's used is research to practice partnerships. So Carmen and I were talking about education research, and so out of large research projects, we're applying the most rigorous methods. We're looking at both some social science and public administration questions. But we have what we call stakeholders in our research. And so, academic audiences are one thing, right? We want to get publishable research out of our the project we're doing. We also look at, so this is education, so our other stakeholders are the staff in the schools who are going to make decisions on policy and programs, the parents who care about, what are the impacts of these changes or interventions you're trying, and as well as other other organizations outside of the where our research is focused, right? So other school districts elsewhere. So what we've done then was we've developed, like we were saying, briefs. We call them a research brief or a policy brief. They're 1 to 2 pages. They're concise, and they're directed towards someone who tells you this is why the research is relevant to you, and this is what you can do with it. So, like, parents, here's what you can do based on this research that will hopefully make your kids' educational outcomes better. Or the district, here's where your policy lever is, and here's where you need to push it in order to get better outcomes for your students. But that's a whole other type of product that we have to invest the time in, and we also have to invest a lot of time, because what Brad was saying, a lot of time working with our partners in the school system so that they see what we're generating as relevant evidence. So that's where some of some of the research on the research practice partnership models have come out and saying, like, even if you can argue, hey, I get this published here, it's a solid piece of social science evidence. It doesn't mean someone in a role like that is going to see that. They have different ways that they legitimize evidence. And so unless we're working closely with them and they have trust and confidence, or they really do see our work is relevant to their specific context and problems they're dealing with. So I think that's a whole other level of work that you do as researchers, and make those connections and to build those connections and to have your work. And that's stuff that we don't really get paid for, in the sense like we don't get tenure off of that we do because we care that about our research we're doing and about the public good and those things. So.
Well, if I can add to that, and that's why those professional associations I think are so important, because if I went to one of my clients, who's the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and wanted to talk about what school teachers in Denmark are doing with performance data, they would think I was crazy, right? But the office that I'm supporting is responsible for performance data and how they're managing or measuring the effectiveness of border control. And so understanding how people use performance data and the different motivations that underpin performance data is relevant. Those connections aren't going to be made unless you have that dialogue. And so I think bridging that findings that you may have in an academic piece to something that's actually translatable and is applied, that has to happen through that network.
One of the things I talked about this morning was how there was this desire to turn public administration into a social science, and that motivated the creation of JPART and the PMRA. And one of the critiques that we've gotten, I think, from some communities is that by focusing so much on social science, we've lost our connection with the practitioner community, that there's a trade-off between those things. And that may be true, but I feel much more confident about the information we're giving to the practitioner community than I would have 10 or 20 years ago. And again, we have to have credibility when we come to the table, which is to say, these results are real, this is based on good evidence, otherwise another community is going to take that place from us. So we're now at a point where we're much more like a social science, and we're trying to get back to communicating skillfully with practitioners, and that's important, but I think it was necessary for us to become a social science first to earn a place at the table of policymakers.
So now I think it's we've almost reached the end. I have to say, I mean, when I became the editor of our journal, I faced an issue. If you see the numbers, it's a very old journal in Brazil, so it's been published for several decades, and it's hard to find the main themes of publishing in public administration. And that's a challenge, because I believe that we have to build an identity for the field. People that feel that they are part of a bigger field, and part of public administration. Because in some times of the history, is public administration trajectory in Brazil has been threatened. We almost lose the few programs that exist, and so I mean, and I think there is still a good, strong social contribution that we can make, for example, in Brazil, and that's why I think it would be interesting to build a special number, probably with international, national collaboration, in a good topic that it has it can be appealing to a Brazilian audience or to a broader audience. And I don't think we will finish this issue today, but I hope that people can establish a conversation about what those issues would be. I particularly think that there are such topics, and we don't care so much yet for the impact of the citation number. I do think that a spatial number probably will have a higher citation rates because it will lose the disparity of the themes that we have right now. So I'm sympathetic to that, but I mean it's a conversation. I don't ask this because do the other
how to build a community, really a community with its own identity. Yeah, because especially in our terms, when we're talking about the public management, especially here in Brazil, we are talking a very broad agenda. Something much broader than, for example, when we are focusing on state, for example, because we have all those issues of constructing this. So we have this very recursive notion that we need to, and also we need also to develop our own venues to publish our own. Yeah, because we have API, we have Cadernos, we have also BGS, for example, which are very, well, not happy, but our journals are very new, and we are fighting also to attract the best papers, with better quality, etc., which is also something that is there. So how to do this kind of collaboration. This is a very important issue.
We were talking the last time that it doesn't seem to be very easy in the States also. I mean, this diversity is not something, I think the numbers are really different in Brazil. So
Yeah.
even though it's a huge country and there are a huge number of programs, there are not so many programs focusing on public administration. And that's a problem. We have people from different programs related to administration or political science or international relations that contribute to public administration, but not programs. We have just one PhD program, as I'm aware of, just dedicated to public administration, just one program. That's now we have two. They just left. The people from this summer. We just approved the second program. So I mean, this would be the second program.
One of the key issues from from the Latin American audience that I think that would interest you guys in a comparative assessment would be the decision-making process inside of the executive branch, because different than the US, for instance, in which the executive here is very powerful, the president is very powerful, is very, is the agenda setter, propose the agenda. There are many proposals that, and actually the great majority of bills approved in Congress have initiated by the executive branch, different than the US, for instance. But that's what we know already, but we don't know how is the process itself inside of the executive. To what extent there is a coordinator inside of the executive? Is there a branch inside of the executive that coordinates the action? For instance, to what extent a bill that has been supported by many or by 2 or 3 different branches of the executive would have a higher probability of becoming a law, of being implemented, or not? So, and something like what would be the decision inside of the executive, and how is the process of nomination of cabinet members and also and junior ministers responsible for implementing the policy of specific branches of the executive. And some branches of the government have been more effective than others. But why? We don't know that. In the case of Brazil, and I would say Latin America, in which the executive is very powerful. So something that would interest me a lot in comparative perspective, it would be to get engaged in a research agenda to analyze the extent to which a bill would pass through and different executive agencies much easier than others, depending on who proposed the bill, who supports the bill, who opposes the bill, especially in our lane in which we have coalition government, which is theoretically more complicated to approve policies than in the US environment. Having said that, in the US it's not that easy lately either, right? Because we have a divided government over there, so everything is blocked by Congress. But from the executive perspective, it would be interesting to investigate in comparative perspective. And so that might be an extremely relevant issue, and that both happy and also.
I think the interesting thing would be to take that from after you do the descriptive kind of comparative work, and then ask what are the why should we care questions, right? So what are the implications of that? Or like you were saying, is policy get through faster? Is it better
More
designed?
efficient,
Is it more efficient? So those would be the why it matters questions to follow up on once you figure out descriptively what would be the possible reasons you would expect differences, right?
Yeah.
After you figure that out, and then do you see them?
Yeah.
You know, when I hear you say that question, my first response is that, well, that's more of a governance question. Like the journal governance, that's a more natural fit with that journal than with JPART, and there's a group structure of governance that focuses just on this question of the politics and exercise of administrative power. They meet every year as well. They're supposed to meet in Turkey this June. I don't know if they'll be able to do that. And I think that's sort of one of the challenges, is to figure out, there might be a particular niche group that cares intensely about that particular question, and that's your community. If that's what you're interested in, they're going to be much more interested in that question in governance than the general JPART readership would be. And they're going to be much more likely to cite that paper in governance than if it was published in JPART. But go ahead.
Stuff in JPART, I mean, like the Wooden Waterman, there's a number of some of the stuff, Krauss, and others who are looking at a little bit about, administrative control of the ability to have political control or congressional control or influence over what goes on within the agencies. I think you're right, but it's still the most compelling pieces. Some compelling pieces still get published in JPART in general.
Not only that, I think that there are some theoretical issues that we don't know. There are open questions, theoretical questions, not only empirical questions, but in terms of and not only in terms of efficiency, but the decision making itself. In terms of coalition building and coalition management, and this is an issue that JPART could get engaged with as well, because we don't know. Very few people understand well and how president coordinates their cabinet members in order to make policies and real. And in terms of parliamentary regime, people know better because they have a larger tradition of coalition government. But in presidential regimes that we do have in Latin America, about all Latin American presidential regimes have coalition government. So in other words, coalitions built by many parties with different ideological preferences, different policy agendas. So how we put together this thing? How we make this government to work? Those are completely open questions. We don't know, theoretically speaking, beyond empirical and puzzles. We don't have theoretical answers to these things.
But some of those questions are being asked in other literature too. So if you're looking at how the different political parties or presidential appointments matter, you see that literature in political science journals.
We do.
Right, and when you look at across countries in the different political frameworks that someone might use, then you might see them in IR journals or comparative study journals as well. So like in JPART, and we talked about some of this a little earlier, we get involved in the policy part, but because there's all these other journals that deal specifically with policy analysis, like JPAM, or policy process, like the political science journals. Our focus has been more on the policy implementation side. Once a policy is sort of created, how then can the current government control or influence the agency's actions to implement a policy? And what are the processes by which a president or a Congress or others could influence what happens in that agency to implement a policy that's already been approved? And you can then see, as Carolyn was talking about earlier, there's a lot of variation in how different states might try to influence their agencies or to do these things. And that's the kind of stuff that JPART has looked at, is this policy implementation and the administrative control or political control over agencies in terms of administration of policies rather than the policies themselves or even how effective these policies are. So part of this is all these topics are incredibly important, but we have more than one discipline, more than one set of journals, all tackling their little angles of it. I did a piece in PAR a number of years ago where I said, if you look at the public administration journals, which you think political science is very important to us for what we try to study, the politics and how the political system works. And management is very important to us, whether it's the Academy Management journals and those kinds of things. And I looked at the top journals in PA, and sure enough, they don't cite almost at all management journals. That's changed quite a bit. And they almost never cite political science journals. So here are two areas of lots of research out there, very important to what we do. And we don't read them. And we don't cross-pollinate. And you do see that. I mean, I think in JPAR, especially perhaps because I wrote that piece in PAR, we get a lot more submissions at JPAR now that cite Academy Management journals. And those kinds in the psychology journals, when they're talking about decision-making and experiments, you're starting to see more and more of that. I'm not so sure that's true with political science, that we're citing more and more political science work, but we should be, because there are a lot of really good people that are doing this kind of work that we could be learning from, and then they could be learning from us, because there's stuff that they that they are not thinking of that we've already thought of, right? And I think this is a different issue than relevancy to the practitioners. But you've got a lot of different academic communities studying, groping at different parts of the elephant while all being blind and not talking to each other. Right.
No, I got it. I got your point, no doubt. But even beyond the decision making, what I'm trying to say is that there are huge differences in terms of the outcome of a policy to the extent how they have been decided, right? So the implementation would be affected, of course, as you know that, would be affected by the way governments decided, if it was a very protracted process, or if it was a very fast-tracking process. So depending on the avenue of the decision-making, would have a completely different implementation process. So would answer people's demand or not, or would be effective or not. So, and what I'm trying to say is that perhaps comparing different institutional settings which have similarities, presidential regimes, federalism, all those are common ground between Latin America and the US, but we do have very different and differences with regard to policy implementation. So why you guys implement the policy more efficient than us? Is that anything related to how we operate? How we decide policies? So is it a matter of bureaucracy? Is it a matter of efficiency inside of the government or not? Or it's a matter of the coalition management? How we decide policy inside of a very fragmented government that we have here? So this is something that might interest you. I would love to get engaged and having the US as a benchmark and having many cases.
I don't think you want to use us as a
No,
benchmark
come
for too
on.
many
You-
things, 'cause
no.
we're not
Kind of
exactly.
like
No,
just
no,
demonstrating
in terms of-
Familia Brazil probably was more efficient.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carolyn's
In
fine.
some points, we could, in some points we could work as a benchmark, such as universal health policy. We have universal health policy since 1988 in Brazil.
Yeah.
You guys are teenagers in this kind of policy, so we can, of course, if you're gonna observe implementation of health policy in Brazil would be extremely helpful to you. But I mean, we could think about a seminar with a particular agenda in a congress or conference or so, in which we could, select papers based on that particular agenda, and in a comparative perspective on policy implementation in different institutional and environments.
Yeah, and I don't know if you were here for Carolyn's presentation, but she talked about.
I haven't, sorry about that.
Income transfers, but her work here in Brazil, I will never say it right, the policy you worked with. Costa Familia, she was making the argument that here's a policy that pretty much started here in Brazil and Mexico.
Yes.
And has been very successful and has spread. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that across countries, especially because other countries who are also implementing this policy.
Still ongoing.
It's still ongoing, and they are doing it differently to fit into different cultures. And we actually, we were talking about how it would be good to have workshops sort of centered around these sort of shared policy interests that, across countries that might be able to learn lessons from each other a little bit more than maybe what we do already.
Definitely.
Yeah.
If I may, I would come back to this point, which I think is framed very appropriately in terms of how do we aggregate and shape the identity of this field of public administration. As you can see, it's what we have here is very cross-disciplinary in terms of the influences that tackle the problems that we have been working with in the past years or decades. And of course, it's been very, very interesting to hear Professor Bradley and Donald about the JPAR and how they frame their research as a problem. Only to say that how do we aggregate without closing too much and making things too abstract for our reality, not only in terms of the problems we have, but also the theories that we use because they are important for us, of the context. And
I would actually recommend you think about your work. So, like you said, you have a number of different journals you have here in Brazil. So you could think about the piece that you write that speaks to your audiences here. But then if you think about that, so what part of that, so if you're looking at a specific change that happened in a particular city or state or whatever, then go up from there and say, what are the bigger things that we learn from this? And then again, forget about, maybe JPAR isn't the right thing, but what other journal, that gets maybe more international kind of viewing, could I take that contribution to? How could I connect that with these others? So, I mean, it's not unusual for us to do different types of work, and then, so like the work I was talking about, I'm also publishing a piece specific to, publish a piece of world development as a whole, or speaking to the development economists and others like that, relevant to some of the things that I learned from that same evaluation, and so you could take a piece of work you've worked on and develop it for different audiences. I mean, obviously, as scholars, we have memorize ourselves. But I think that's something that you could also think of, so that you actually like make it into publications. Same effort would be bringing a piece for a different audience, trying to draw your lessons up and out, as well as to have it relevant to your, publishing journals, your, other ways of descending, or something that we were talking about earlier.
I don't think this is solved with the journal. JPAR was created because it was a missing piece, not because the other journals weren't doing other important things, because there was an important thing missing in the field, so it was created around that. And if there wasn't practitioner journals, there weren't these other kinds of things, that people who created JPAR would have created that. So maybe I'll be yelled at by parents or not, but I mean, I'm very proud of what JPAR has done and the stuff I get published, but that's just one journal. If the whole field and all the journals did what JPAR did, the field would be much worse for it. But I do believe the field is better because JPAR is now another venue.
Of course, I didn't mean in any way that
Yeah.
JPAR was not a contribution in that sense. I'm saying that having a field so fragmented and multidisciplinary and plural as we have here, it's very hard to concentrate in one approach such as JPAR or in any other approach or any other niche. So you need to think in terms of more widely than.
Yes, if I may continue with this argument, and I would also like to go back to Alquintas, when she mentioned precisely this more almost undefined field of public administration as we have it here. And I would take this characteristic not as a weakness, but as our strength. Because being very multidisciplinary, as he's mentioning, and having, because of our history of not having PhDs or even MSCs in specifically public administration, we have this very strong intersection with organization studies. And I think that this characteristic provides for us a more comprehensive approach of phenomena that are related to government, to the intersection with civil society, to all these topics that how policy making and coalitions are built, and how they influence the implementation and result of politics. I myself, I'm a medical doctor. I come from the field of public health. I was in the struggle for the public health system when I was starting as a public health worker. So how can I be coming from public health, that is precisely public administration, how can I tackle these topics without emphasizing all this multidisciplinary dimension and politics? I have been reading Laswell lately, and I think that we are missing Laswell, how can I say, emphasis on the political dimension of government. So I think we should, in my view and in my own research, go back to these classics that are North American but are also universal, that tell us, come on, let's go back to the political dimension of public administration as it is on the, you mentioned early in the morning. Let's have, of course, the managerial aspects, but let's put it in the right place. So I think this is a strength we have in Brazil, and I think that our journals are still keeping this strength, and I would very much like that we could proceed in this direction. And I think this would make our exchanges richer.
I would endorse everything that you said. And I see parallels between what you said and some of my experiences writing about administrative burdens, or my frustration, one of my frustrations with red tape literature is that it paid no attention to the politics of rule creation. And part of my goal was to demonstrate that such politics actually existed, that political values were in play, that parties cared about some rules versus others in very explicit ways. But I had to develop a theory to bring that conversation back in, and I think, drawing on Laswell is great, but you want to look for what are the theories in political science that let you have that conversation.
No, and just for Laswell as a kind of let's remember politics, let's not leave it aside.
Well, no, exactly that point has been made by, I think recently, Don Kettle, Brent Miller, Alistair Roberts, where they're complaining that public administration has forgotten about the big questions. Back in 1950, we asked these really big questions about statecraft, and now we're much more focused on, I think it was
Managerial tools.
behavioral management questions. And so, other people, I think, share that frustration as well, and I think there's something to that.
There will be what Paul Lake described as, he calls them tides of reform. It's the same thing, the tides within academia, right?
Yeah.
If we swing too much towards the micro-behavioral, there will be a pulling back of that, and I think that's what we just need to do.
There'll be a panel about big questions with Don.
We'll throw Brad out and get someone else.
But that'll be at our house this summer,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that'll start a fight. We'll engage in that discussion, but that is exactly how these ideas change over time.
Yeah, well, this is a good fight though. I mean, it's something that's always so it's something to discuss. I mean, I would like to have the discussion. I miss when there's nothing to discuss. This is a very
The conflict.
when you have nothing to say.
Yeah, the difference in
Yeah.
all the different places.
Yes.
In the U.S., most of the people studying health don't, the implementation of the health acts are doing it in health fairs, other journals where people of public administration may not even read if health is their area.
There was some hard issue on that.
Yeah, there is.
There is a public administration review.
But again, you don't have these groups of different scholars taking different approaches, all caring and studying the same thing. They don't always talk to each other as much as they should. And I think that's where the conversation, it is maybe I'm biased because the U.S. political system is very pluralistic, right? Pitting groups against each other, it's their self-interest and their approaches to even studying things. And I think that's there's a real advantage in doing that. And I don't think the field is ever going to come up with a journal or an association that is ever going to capture fully what needs to go on. What it needs is multiple groups. And those multiple groups can fight sometimes. What I'd like to see is the multiple groups talk more or read each other's work more.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention too. I mean, I think I've seen it because I have some segments of health research in my stuff I've done, but you have to actively work to cross those boundaries between the people. And what's interesting is one of the people I've worked with most closely here in Brazil, who had a lot of work in the non-treating evaluation system, was an epidemiologist by training. And so he actually, it's always interesting you get in conversations with people who've been trained to think about things in a very different way. What we learn from epidemiologist's perspective about this. And so but I find that I have to, whether it's in my own university or outside my university, I have to work to build those communities of people so we talk. So there are, I think, Affordable Care Act is coming out more. We are going to see a lot more study, and there's collaborations across disciplines coming, but we're never going to get the whole of it. And so there will be groups that will form to partner to study the politics of those, to the other aspects of it. But I think that we have to work harder as researchers to bring out of our collaborations.
One other thing I think your point raises is everyone wants to be interdisciplinary now. So you go to any university, they say we're interdisciplinary, that's a good thing. And we are naturally interdisciplinary, but I think for a long time that meant we were non-disciplinary.
Yeah.
That there was we weren't actually drawing from political science or economics or sociology. We're just sort of making up our own ideas. Sometimes they're good, and sometimes we're not. Whereas I think there's a little bit more true importation of knowledge from disciplines. Where we haven't achieved success yet is exporting knowledge back to disciplines. So the number of PA scholars who publish in core disciplinary journals is very low. So Carolyn's in American Economic Review, that's really unusual. I've gotten a couple of pieces in political science journals, but that's a hard sell. People who hit the top political science journals tend and write about bureaucracies often don't then view themselves as part of the public administration. So we're also looking at a sort of next hurdle for our community here, which is to establish our relevance to disciplines again and communicate why what we're doing has impact